Teste. Então, boas-vindas para esse nosso evento sobre linguística de contato. Muito feliz de ver tanta gente aqui e também acompanhando pelo YouTube. Esse evento, de fato, é resultado de várias colaborações internacionais que temos aqui do Departamento de Linguística. Então, vamos juntar 3 professores de fora, o Kofi Yakpo, de Hong Kong, que vai começar a falar sobre aspectos de contato linguístico transatlântico. E ele é professor convidado, ou seja, visitante aqui durante várias semanas. Já deu um mini curso, é uma pessoa que colabora comigo em vários aspectos. Então, queremos aqui que os alunos, colegas da USP também aproveitassem da presença dele. E também temos presente o Susan Fischer e o Gilberto Recha, da Universidade de Hamburg. Eles estão aqui para acho que uma visita técnica, né, que é por causa de um convênio, né, para reanimar esse convênio com a USP, e eles também trabalham sobre contato linguístico. Então, para nós era uma ótima ocasião para juntar todos esses pesquisadores para fazer um mini simpósio, né, um mini congresso aqui. Então, eu acho que nem me apresentei, né? Para quem não me conhece, sou Alexandra Kovina, professor do Departamento de Linguística, e estou organizando esse evento junto com o Vitor Nóbrega. Aí pode até levantar aqui para o povo da internet, que está recebendo a Suzane e o Gilberto. Então vamos começar com a fala do Kofi Yakpo. O título da fala é The Afro-Atlantic as a Linguistic Area. Então, a área afro-atlântica de um ponto de vista da modalidade, né? Modalidade gramatical. Talvez para falar um pouco sobre o Kofi, para quem não conhece, ele tem muitos anos, acho que já são décadas, né, de experiência em linguística de contato. Trabalhou na África Central, Guiné Equatorial, também na América do Sul, em Suriname, mas também no Caribe, se não me engano, acho que Jamaica, várias situações de contato linguístico atlântico, né? Então, encontro entre as línguas africanas e europeias. E também línguas chamadas de línguas crioulas. Ele vai entrar muito mais em detalhes sobre isso. Mas, então, ele tem muitas publicações sobre o tema. Eu acho que vale a pena de dar uma olhada na página dele. Tem, para quem se interessar nesse tópico, né? Quem se interessar, quem se inspira na fala dele hoje. E, ele está na Universidade de Hong Kong hoje em dia, fez o doutorado em Nijmegen, na Holanda, e a graduação na Universidade de Köln. Então, uma carreira internacional. Estamos muito felizes de ter ele aqui hoje conosco. Esse mês inteiro, de fato, na Universidade de São Paulo. Então, vamos começar com você, Kofi. Já pode assumir aqui sua posição e depois a gente introduz os outros palestrantes, quando for a hora. Só alguma coisa sobre a organização. Cada fala vai ter umas 40 minutos, 30, 40 minutos. Vai ter tempo para perguntas depois e vamos também deixar um pouco de tempo para pausas, para não ficar muito intenso. Para o evento não passa muito das 17 horas, certo? Ok, perfeito. Muito obrigado.
Boa tarde. Vou falar em inglês porque é um tema um pouco complicado para mim, um pouco, sim, de uma complexidade um pouco que depassa um pouco as minhas faculdades linguísticas. Mas se tem perguntas mais tarde em português, podemos também discutir em português, em brasileiro. So my talk, I'm going to have a look at the Afro-Atlantic as a linguistic area, which is a topic that I've been dealing with for quite a while now. While doing research on the so-called Creole languages, and I'll explain in a bit how I define them, and the historical and social conditions that led to the emergence of Creole languages in the Atlantic, you cannot but wonder at the many things that Creole languages do, how they combine features from European source languages and from African source languages. It's a fascinating topic, and when you delve deeper, you actually come to a level of understanding where you can actually pick individual structures apart and see the sources. It's also very telling about the social structures, of course, that existed back then, our understanding of multilingualism maybe in the early period of colonization. And most of all, it kind of destroys many of the very generalizing images we have about Creole languages, that they are simplified languages that, you know, emerged in situations of extreme poverty of input and so forth. And one of these structures we'll have a look at today. I'm going to turn to modality and a particular aspect of modality. So what am I talking about? I am talking about a specific language cluster, a transatlantic language cluster called, which I call, in some of the more recent literature, I've come to like the term African Caribbean English Creole. I treat it as a singular because the differences between varieties like, let me see where the dot is here. There's a dot here. So this one? Oh, here we go. Differences between languages like Jamaican and Nigerian Pidgin are probably as much as between dialectal varieties of Alentejo Portuguese and Nordestino Portuguese, right? So not more. So in that sense, it makes sense to treat it as a language cluster, which nobody has done really so far. It's surprising, but Creoles always get this exceptional treatment. And we can see it's transatlantic. The blue box is the African varieties, and the red one, the Caribbean or American varieties. Now, if we look at the speaker numbers, it's quite striking that a language like that or a cluster like that has passed under the radar of many linguistics departments and other people interested in language. This is just an estimate, but it's based on sources. So, you know, anywhere between 110, 120, and 150 million speakers. The largest part by speakers of the African varieties of ACAEC, so African Caribbean English Creole. Right? Most of the research, and I'd say probably 95% of the research has been on, guess, which one of the two? The 5%. Right? But 95% of the speakers are in Africa. Has many interesting reasons, which I can't delve into. But yeah, those are the facts. If we look at a bit more specifically at some of the speaker numbers, we can see, of course, the giant Nigerian Pidgin, spoken by at least 110 million speakers. Also, these are estimates, so I'm a bit careful. We don't know. Anywhere between maybe 80 million and 130 million in Nigeria, right? We don't know. There are no language census data so far. Just micro censuses, maybe in some towns and cities, but not nationally. Okay? But we can see the staggering numbers. West African Pidgin, which is, you know, the African branch of ACEC, is spoken by more speakers than any other language in the region, including the colonial languages. Right? So the speakers of West African Pidgin are more than even the speakers of the colonial languages put together, like English and French and Portuguese, plus any other African language. Right? If we go into some of the social history, we can see what we get here, or the social aspects, is that we get a situation where the four largest varieties, Creole, Ghanaian Pidgin, Nigerian Pidgin, and Cameroon Pidgin, are spoken in countries where the lexifier, the language that has contributed most of the lexicon, which is English, is also the superstrate, is also the socially superordinate variety which is still used in administration, government, and so forth. One exception is Pichi, which I worked on, where the colonial language is Spanish, the only still Spanish-speaking country, partly Spanish-speaking country of Africa, where we have a non-lexifier superstrate. Pichi, like all the others, has English-derived lexicon, ultimately. It's more complex, but ultimately. And Spanish is the colonial language. Now, when we turn to the other languages in the ecology, we can see that we get different types of adstrates and substrates as well. Substrates, I use the term when there has been a language shift. So when speakers acquire a new language, their old home language becomes a substrate. And adstrate would be continuing multilingualism in various, various different languages. But we can see big differences. These are Bantu adstrates here. These are also Benue Congo, but a bit higher up in the hierarchy, right? Niger Congo. We have Mande, we have Atlantic, we have Mande again, and we have again Yoruba, which is Benue Congo, higher up, right? So very complex situations of multilingualism with different types of inputs. And so the question is really, what does that lead to? The situation in the Caribbean is much more simple, which is why it doesn't make them less interesting. But if you model Creole evolution on the basis of the Caribbean languages, you're going to get a very distorted picture. Why? Because in the Caribbean, the African languages have died. They're gone. They've become real substrates in the sense that all the speakers have shifted. They're no longer in use. They were until, and they still are in religious context, of course, like in Brazil, but they're not living languages, right? So what you get is all the red ones, they have, most of these red ones, they have just an interaction between English and the Creole. Suriname is a bit of an exception where I worked, but let's skip that just for being quick enough. All right, so now what am I going to look at? I'm now going to see, share some of the results of a study I did, something I've been working on for a while, trying to understand how these different forces, lexifier superstrate versus non-lexifier superstrate, different types of adstrates, how they impact on the development of certain grammatical categories, and here particularly modality. And I'm looking at subjunctive. And what we'll see is that there are really deep linguistic connections, of course, between the African and African-descended peoples of the Afro-Atlantic, which we know are parallel in other domains, religion, food, architecture, other types of technology, herding, planting, healing, whatever, right? We know all that. And in linguistics, in the language domain, it's, of course, most striking, maybe because it's just so visible in terms of the language practices. Subjunctive is also interesting because subjunctive is one of these things, again, in the whole discussion about Creole languages. I know that in Brazil, Creole has a different meaning. I got to know that when I was in Salvador, in Bahia, when somebody proudly said to me that they are Creole in a positive term. But then I said, how come? What does Creole mean? So Creole, in that sense, I'm using the old kind of designation Creole, all things that are in the colonies. That's all. No, but in the former colonies, right? All things that happen in the colonies. That's all. That's really what the designation was. Somebody born in the colonies, food eaten in the colonies, houses built in the colonies. That's Creole. Okay? So that's all. Languages that emerged in the colonies, or varieties of European or African languages, depending on how you see that, are spoken in the colonies. Okay? Now, subjunctives are interesting because it's one of those features that we all think is extremely complex, and, anybody who has done Latin or who was tortured by their teachers in formal Portuguese instead of spoken Portuguese, had to learn all these things by heart, whether it's subjunctive appears and everything, right? And of course, it's complex, so it can't be Creole. That of course, is the ideology. And in fact, I think John McWhorter, even in one of his writings, says, Creole languages don't have subjunctives. Creole languages don't have tone. Creole, all this stuff. We did a whole session on tone, I think, right? Yeah, and we still didn't figure it out at the end, right? Yeah. Tone in Creole languages. Okay, so we are talking about certain verb forms, special verb forms, or markers that obligatorily occur in certain types of subordinate clauses. Subordinate clauses, mind you, subjunctive, jungere, right? Subjunctive, subordinate clauses. They're conditioned. The speaker must use them. If there's a certain main verb, there has to be a subjunctive in the dependent clause. Well, if you don't do it, you speak another variety or another register, but yeah, that's how it works. Not like future, where I can decide, tomorrow I will eat, yesterday I ate, right? Different. And here I'm going to focus on these three basic modalities. Deontic modality, so subjunctive occurs in these dependent clauses or subordinate clauses, for example, in contexts where the main verb has, or the context, the modal context is one of these three. Deontic, the existence of force. Epistemic, plus minus assertion, if you want to cluster it under some broader theme. Evidential, plus minus evidence of some sort. Okay, just to make it simple. Now, how about forms? Now, this looks very complex, but it isn't. In English, I told him to leave. Right? Tell somebody to do something, plus force. Main verb has a manipulative semantic component. So, what happens with the subordinate verb, namely leave? In English, it's embedded in a kind of deranked structure. It has a lower rank. It's not a full clause. It's embedded. It can't live on its own. It can't breathe on its own. It has to be embedded. It's deranked. It's lower in rank, syntactically, of course, right? It's lower on the tree. If you compare this now with the structure in Pichi, a variety of West African pidgin, we see a different structure. Atelam se mekilef. This is a more balanced structure. Why? Because we have a complementizer, a general complementizer. Then we have a modal complementizer, but it's a finite complementizer. It's not an infinitive or infinitive or non-finite complementizer like to, right? I can't say I told him to he leave, right? It can only work with infinitive. But that's what this does. I told him that should he leave, basically. All right? So it's a balanced structure. And this is important because the subjunctive marker is a complementizer. Unlike in many European languages where it's a verbal affix or infix or whatever, affix usually, it is a complementizer, right? There's also another aspect here. We have argument sharing, him, so where the syntactic object, him, is the notional subject of the embedded clause or the subordinate clause, right? Here we get two. It's split up. Object, told him, subject, right? Balanced structure. Now, another thing is, what is also surprising is that in all the languages we're going to look at, most of them, not all, but particularly in the Creole languages, the causative verb is at the same time, the causative verb is the source of grammaticalization of the subjunctive complementizer. Right? Makes sense somehow. Force, and then, And we can see this in Fanti, for example, a language of Ghana. Same form. Or ma, or ko. Right? Same form, just one low and high tone has to do with the unmarked kind of, or the inflected form that's usually in inflected context has a high tone. So, right? But there's also some phonological erosion going on, which I won't go into. Right? Creole and Pichi, lef. Isomorphic, same structure, apart from the completive affix. But we also find this in West Africa, where the causative verb, but we don't have a subjunctive here. It's she made he leave. Not she made that subjunctive he leave. And in Ghanaian Pidgin, we also find imik ilef. Right? Mind you, very different from the English structure, I made him or her leave, where you again have a deranked structure. This is still a balanced structure, but there's no subjunctive complement. So there's a bit of a causative exception. The causative is semantically often more integrated. It plays a huge role in communication, pragmatics. So there's a bit of an exception there. The causative is, I mean, it fills volumes and volumes of linguistic work, just the causative, and for a good reason, because it's a very, usually more grammaticalized structure. It has a lot of syntax as well, but there are also elements that are idiosyncratic in causative constructions. And in many languages, of course, there are affixes and whatever, right? So even further, not in these languages, but in many there are, of course, right? Now, I made a survey of about 20 languages in West Africa, collected data, and we get an interesting distribution. We get those languages, mostly Kwa, where the subjunctive complementizer and the cause verb are the same, or at least derive from each other. Then we get languages, Bantoid and Benue Congo, so Yoruba and Co, where we have a subjunctive complementizer, but the cause verb is different, right? And then we have languages from both groups where you also have a verbal affix of some sort, but the subjunctive complementizer is always there, right? What then happens is we get a subjunctive, an African subjunctive in a way, where we have deontic, it's limited to the deontic domain, right? There are no overlaps with epistemic or evidential. And if we have the line here between realis and factual, let's say that's the red line, right? All the other stuff here is modality, kind of marked modality, and the other is non-existence of modality, basically in the realis side, right? We get these different classes of main verbs or clause types where we get subjunctive. So there's an overlap with the deontic domain. It's different in the European languages, just to show you the difference. In the European languages, the European in sense of the Sprachbund, the European Sprachbund linguistic area, we find overlaps of subjunctive going into hypothetical, for example, in Portuguese, seu, fosse, right? Past subjunctive, which is not, doesn't work like that in Africa. You even have possibility. And then you have also evidential, of course, right? And here, just Portuguese, I'm not going to go through all of it, but just to show the difference, the typological differences, right? Portuguese, where you have strong and weak deontic main verbs, just like in the African languages. And then you have want, but then causative, you have an embedded deranked structure, and then you have epistemic main verbs, assertion. I know that many people don't use this stuff, right? I wouldn't either, but I'm not a competent speaker like you. But I'm sure many of you wouldn't. But do you all do this? You all do this, right? But do you this? Dizem que ela esteja doente? You don't do this, right? How about parece que ela tenha estudado muito? Yeah, right? So this is, it's already falling apart here, at least in many varieties, spoken varieties, right? This is probably textbook or whatever. Or maybe it was like that some time ago, but it no longer is. Let's have a look at the African languages. So this is Yoruba, which of course you all know. It's an important substrate or adstrata language during a certain point of the development of Brazilian, and a lot of cultural legacies, of course, from Yoruba-speaking peoples of Nigeria. So watch the key. Key is the subjunctive marker. Yoruba belongs to one of those languages where the cause verb and the complementizer are not derived, are not in any form of etymological relationship, right? So we get it here for directives, let us go, right? And we get it for strong deontic verbs. So she asked, yao, ayo, let her come. If you want the let, right? If you want just for causative, there's a bit of a causative exception. Again, you can't additionally use the general quotative or general complementizer, but apart from that, you have the key as well. Weak deontic, I'll try hard to eat a lot. Try, it's also manipulative, but lightly. There's force, but it's light, right? And purpose clauses, which also have a manipulative force component, weaker as well, right? She went there to study or something, yeah? she went to Ibadan so that she could get treatment. But we find it very nicely and neatly. It's really a very nice, it shows the whole kind of functional area. Ibe is a bit, so that's Bay, the Bay languages, which also played a huge role in Brazil. We have Na, but we get a bit of an exception. For example, want. Medibe ma yap, that's number 3. You can't not use the quotative. You have to do it. While elsewhere, so want is closer, for some reason you need the complementizer there. And you have an infix for want. You only get the na third person, right? So you have this micro variation in these languages of West Africa where sometimes the paradigm is really neat and nice and sometimes it isn't, but it's always, it's either the affix, the verbal or infix here, or it's the complementizer, or it's both, right? And we have the causative exception again. I make she leave. She come here, right? And again, cause verb, give is the cause verb, and you get the same na as a complementizer up there, chi, naja, let the rain fall, right? So you have, again, homophonous and you know, etymologically related forms fulfilling. Now, let's have a look at West African pidgin, so the African varieties of ACEC. Here we get make. Mind you, make, again, make is the causative verb and has been grammaticalized or taken over. It's probably more a calque than a real grammaticalization. You know, it's very easy to just pattern it along existing semantic, you know, structures or semantically kind of copy what you already had. In the African languages, you get the causative verb make, which then functions also as a subjunctive complementizer, right? Make we go. It tell me say, make I go bring water, strong, deontic. Tell somebody to do that. I won't say make you do something, give me, right? I want you to do something for me. I make you left. Interesting here. Now we get the double, like Infanti. Mind you, phonologically, there's some erosion. So, I make me left. That's how you'd say it, right? So, erosion of the final vela stop. You also have tonal fusion going on. For example, ma come, should I come? Not make I come, should I come? It's ma come. Get a contour tone. You get the erosion of k. You get a vowel merger. But that only works with the subjunctive complementizer, not with make as a lexical verb, right? So textbook case of grammaticalization, right? And so forth, right? So very nice and neat. The African situation is very nice and neat, just like the African languages we've looked at that are spoken in the same region, the Art Straits, but it starts falling apart in the Americas, in the American varieties of ACEC. We have, for example, Sranang, spoken in Suriname, where we get Mekago, yeah, same as before. Ataigi and Mekago, so he told him to go, but also Ataigi and Fugo. Fu is to. It's the infinitive or non-finite complementizer, structurally exactly the same as Dutch te. Yeah? So don't forget Sranang, Suriname, official language, Dutch. Or English too. In fact, in that respect, they're really very similar, right? You don't need to look far. And then you have alternatives like me wan meka carrying. I absolutely want him here to carry. That's strong if you put the make there. And it's slightly weaker when you do me wan data mus carrying. So, and then you get modal harmony, like should, you know, I suggested that he should come, or I suggested that he come, or versus I suggested that he should come, kind of subjunctives, right? And you have that, a complementizer borrowed from Dutch, right? So you're getting more European structures. Then we get the causative with no subjunctive at all, which, you know, which looks like the Ghanaian subjunctive, and Be and the Ewe subjunctive. Be is one of the most important substrate languages of Suriname, so we get this kind of correspondences there. And then we get, again, purpose, mi sen and meka go sribi. So I sent him or her to go sleep. Or the non-infinitive again. All this is not possible. The full varieties are not possible in the African, where it's strictly subjunctive. Jamaica gets even more fragmented, right? Now, mind you, Suriname, No English spoken for the last 350 years. Dutch influence. Dutch typologically very similar with English, so we get a lot of transfer that's similar, but it's not as bad as in the places where English has been spoken continuously. Similarities in form lead to easier borrowing between typologically related languages very clearly, because we have more cognitive links on more levels than just function. We also have form correspondence. We have form priming, right? We have form priming psychologically, right? And we have verbs that have similar meanings. We have sentence structures that overlap, and so it's messier, right? Semantic change can proceed faster and more thoroughly when the languages are so closely related, particularly when one of them, like English, is in a socially dominant position, right? But we see in English, in Jamaican, me tell them to give me money. So I told them to give me the money, right? Not me tell them, say, make them give me the money, right? It's fu. So the modality is, fee is also a modal element. It's a very complex form. It's derived from for, but it has a whole range of functions that are really different from for. But one of them, of course, is non-finite complementizer. And here we get something that's very similar to English, right? So when it's strong, we still have make, the subjunctive, but the weaker we get, and we look at want now. Want is actually still deontically very strong. It's force, it's strong force, but somehow it doesn't. Me want them fi come. You can't do me want make them come anymore. It's not possible. That's ungrammatical, right? And then we get Trinidad English Creole, where we get a totally different structure, where there's no make anymore. In fact, Trinidadian speakers tell me they can do number one. Make you come. But it's very basilectal. It's very rural. It's very, right? Which shows that it's probably transitioned from a more conservative rural varieties to something that resembles English more and more. And in fact, many people will tell you that Trinidad English Creole is a tricky language because it resembles English so much that it's impossible to know whether it's a variety of English or a variety of African Caribbean English Creole, right? Depending on your viewpoint. I would say, of course, African Caribbean English Creole. But somebody who works on English will say, no, it's variety of English, right? That's what happens when you have typologically, lexically, and historically closely related languages, right? Now, summary. What we get is we get the African varieties of ACEC plus West African languages, yeah, very broad, very, yeah, broad, doing basically the same thing, right? Basically doing the same thing. West Africa, homonym of causative verb. We've seen, for example, that Yoruba doesn't have a homonym, so the subjunctive complementizer, but functionally is exactly the same, all right? Then we get languages in the middle, the American languages, where we have a declining Africanness. The more we get into languages that have long histories of contact with English and long histories of non-contact with African outstraits, right? The more European it gets, the more English it gets. And then we get English, where we have Trinitalk, Trinidadian Creole English, and English basically doing the same thing. The only thing is the conditional, if I were you, something like that. But then many people don't do that. Many people say, if I was you, right? So even there in English, it's actually dying, right? Yeah. So it's very, I think a lot of like more spoken varieties wouldn't do where you at all, actually, right? They depend, you don't, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Only when you're speaking fancy, exactly, that's it, right? The subjunctive has become a fancy thing. I suggest that you come. I don't really do that, you know. You know, so it's a written form. In fact, there's evidence that shows that the subjunctive was recreated and refashioned through literary activity, and that it had died already and was resuscitated. It's like a zombie, basically. It's a linguistic zombie. It's a walking dead, right? Manipulated by writers, you know, like a puppet. But it's not really used, right? So, okay, I tried to sum up all this. I took a sample of all these languages, so the three most important African that we know historically, very important substrate and outstrate languages of the major varieties, ACAC varieties, and English. And I made a dendrogram, neighbor joining, phylogenetic modeling, and we get this nice tree, which, well, looks better if we turn it like this, because then we get Africa here and we get the Americas there, right? And then we have a geographic axis. And what we get is we indeed get Nigerian pidgin, Cameroon pidgin, Pichi, Ghanaian pidgin, Yoruba, and Creole clustering very closely. Now, why Yoruba? Because Yoruba was the most important substrate for Creole in the 19th century. And Creole spread from Sierra Leone. We did that during the mini course. Creole spread from Sierra Leone through West Africa and birthed the other varieties, right? So we get a strong substrate signal from Yoruba. And you remember the mik and the ki, they are really the same. The only difference again is that speakers of these languages, they needed some semantic material to hold on to. So what did they do? Well, people were multilingual, they had experience with other languages where the causative verb and the modal complementizer are the same, so they didn't care whether Yoruba didn't do it, but applied an areally widespread pattern, semantic pattern, where the causative verb and the complementizer are the same. And what do? You don't use give, because the causative verb in English is not give, it's make. So you end up with make. Right? Is that plus discussion or without discussion? 10 minutes. Okay, then let me close. Right? So we get this kind of, oh, sorry, let me just explain the end here. So we get the east-west axis, and then we get Sranang, Suriname, Jamaican, Tobagonian on one, and then we get English and Trinidad English Creole here, right? So it was a long list of features. I had like 30 features just to make it more complex than the table we had before. So we get this really nice transatlantic climb of Africanness versus Europeanness or Englishness, right? And we basically have a gradient typological profile. And just to make it fun and sexy, you could say that in Africa we have the Afrosphere, and then we have the Eurosphere, and they converge on the Creolosphere as an areal buffer zone, a term that I owe to Stilo, 2005. He used it for Iranian and Turkic convergence, right? Very beautiful term, I think, and fantastic study. Hardly anybody cites it. Beautiful study from Stilo, 2005. So we get the Afrosphere, which kind of tapers off into the Americas, but is of course also present in popular Brazilian Portuguese in some features, right? We get Afrosphere features. We get, for example, in Portuguese, we get topic and focus prominence, much more than subject prominence in Brazilian. We get this kind of very interesting noun phrase marking where the first element gets a plural and the rest doesn't, right? Which is very much, which Yoruba does, or you can do it the other way around, like in Ewe, where you only have the plural marking at the very end of the noun phrase, but it's the same principle, right? It was so nice when we went by here. My ears just popped open and I heard all this beautiful stuff going on, you know, like just us, and then Koiza, Linda, and you know, all these nice things. You people are lucky, you speak such a beautiful variety of Portuguese. So, not that dusty European stuff. So, Eurosphere is the other way around, of course, right? So we get prepositions, for example, stress systems, not tone systems. We get pronominal gender and so forth, right? And then we get the Creolosphere somewhere in the middle, which, as we've seen, you know, kind of combines both, depending on where they are on the geographic line and in terms of the social ecology, right? What is the influence of European languages? Very strong. Whether in contact with the lexifier or not, yes or no, right? So that's really what it is, right? So what we see, of course, is that we have classical processes of areal and genetic differentiation, nothing new in the sense that anything exceptionally Creole is happening. We get this with all languages. And then we have these macro-areal convergence zones, and then we get the Creolosphere as a kind of buffer zone that constitutes the core of this Afro-Atlantic linguistic area, which tapers off into the European, the varieties of European languages in the Americas spoken by more European-descended peoples. And then you have, on the other hand, you have African languages in Africa, which, you know, where the Creole languages share features, but you also have the European languages spoken in Africa, which have much fewer African features, but still also, so basically the mirror image of the European languages spoken in the Americas, right? So that's basically it. Thank you.
Or 10 minutes pergunta and 5 minutes toilet. Alright. Bom, pode ser português agora, né? Ele já falou que ele vai responder perguntas em português ou pode ser em inglês. Então, multilinguismo acadêmico aqui. Bom, então vou abrir para a plateia. Levante a mão, eu vou lá.
Obrigado. Em português mesmo? Tá. Não, você vai perguntar da árvore filogenética. Eu queria perguntar dos caracteres filogenéticos que você usou. Você usou aqueles... Cadê? Peraí. Você pode voltar uma? Por favor. Isso, então. Aí você usou esses subject complementizers. Só foi baseado nisso. Você chegou a fazer alguma outra com as outras também ou não?
Fiz também uma com... Just a bit. Fiz também uma com, digamos, não o dendrograma, mas um mapa filogenético, não? Com as distâncias numa rede, assim, a coisa que você faz também. Mas isso é melhor porque posso manipular um pouco seguinte esta distribuição geográfica que me parecia interessante.
Mas aí continua sendo um tipo de neighbor net, do mesmo jeito.
Um neighbor net é uma forma de dendrograma. É só uma outra maneira de representar um pouco o mesmo fenômeno.
Tá bom, obrigado.
Obrigado. Tá? Bom, Kofi, eu queria perguntar, na verdade, deixa eu pensar como eu elaboro melhor. Eu achei muito interessante esses dados que você trouxe, porque eu não sei se você vai lembrar uma das pesquisas que eu apresentei lá em Angola, que era sobre o subjuntivo também, na variedade de português de lá. E aí, uma dificuldade que eu tive em relação quando a gente vai trabalhar com o português, nessas línguas europeias, que estão em contato, né, com línguas, eu gostaria de saber um pouco da sua opinião, é porque é isso, eu identifiquei que muitas vezes os verbos não eram conjugados nessa forma do subjuntivo. A Márcia já tinha feito uma pesquisa com variedades aqui do interior de São Paulo, que mostravam dados ainda mais interessantes. Por exemplo, você mostrou aquele exemplo lá, acho que ela não, espero que ela não saiba disso. E todo mundo falou, eu falaria assim. E nessas variedades do interior, isso não seria falado. Seria, espero que ela não sabe disso. E até mesmo outras formas que, para a gente aqui, talvez na capital, não seja uma variação tão possível. E aí, uma dificuldade que eu tinha em relação a como analisar esses dados seria se isso de fato teria alguma influência do contato linguístico com essas línguas africanas que talvez transmitam essa modalidade do irrealis, do subjuntivo, de um outro modo, ou se isso está realmente só sendo uma tendência, igual você falou, do subjuntivo ser uma coisa que até no inglês pode ser que esteja morrendo, uma coisa meio, sei lá, Frankenstein, zumbi. Você acha que isso é uma tendência dessas formas subjuntivas? Estarem mesmo caindo e ficando restritas a alguns registros comunicativos, ou nesses casos de línguas europeias faladas em contextos multilingües, pode ter uma influência desse contato?
Na história, digamos, do desenvolvimento das línguas europeias, o subjuntivo, muitas das vezes, é uma forma morrendo, sim. E por isso só aparece em frases, em cláusulas, como se diz? Orações dependentes, não? E muitas das vezes vais ver no desenvolvimento histórico de uma língua as formas que morrem, aparecem digamos, em contextos mais marginais, não as orações principais. Né? Penso que em todas as línguas românicas o subjuntivo é uma forma um pouco fraca. E são muitas das vezes formas que têm algo de antigo, então, mas podem sobreviver também durante muito tempo, depende do uso, não? E o problema que o português, o brasileiro tem, é que não tem um outro complementizer que poderia funcionar como o equivalente do make ou do que. Por isso temos só que o que, também que, pode ser que vem do Yorubá, o que. E por isso temos, não, é muito difícil de verificar onde são as fontes desse desenvolvimento. Mas claro que tem muitos fenômenos que não temos bem investigados, e pode ser também que tem uma certa influência de línguas africanas de substrato nessa desaparência do subjuntivo, mas é um pouco especulativo. Porque a função existe, só a maneira de marcar é diferente. E é limitada, nas línguas africanas, é limitada a função do subjuntivo ao contexto deôntico. E é um pouco diferente nas línguas europeias, onde o subjuntivo é mais modal no senso global, não só deôntico.
Então, muito obrigada aí, Kofi, pela apresentação. Eu queria saber se você chegou a observar a realização das possibilidades de correferencialidade, porque eu vi que você tem alguns exemplos que na subordinada você tem um pronome de terceira pessoa, um ele, e na principal também um ele. Eles são correferenciais ou são coisas diferentes? Ou isso varia? Porque isso no português brasileiro é bastante dependente, por exemplo, pelo menos para mim, do verbo querer, com o verbo fazer, ou quando você tem outros verbos, como dizer, acreditar. E aí tem uma grande variação, onde você pode, e o subjuntivo tem uma tendência a evitar a correferencialidade. Então, eu queria saber se você chegou a observar essa questão.
Muito interessante. Uma questão muito interessante e muito relevante. Infelizmente não tenho investigado. Isso é o problema. Então posso só especular porque o subjuntivo, claro, temos essa correferencialidade formal e normalmente podem ser, mas no causativo não faz sentido, claro. Mas em outros contextos pode ser. Então, por exemplo, e tem se go chop, ele pensa que ele vai comer. Não, isso não é subjuntivo. Em todos os contextos deônticos, normalmente tem uma força que é aplicada a uma outra pessoa, não? E é um pouco a semântica dessa construção. E se não tem um pronome reflexivo, se não é o caso, não? I force myself make a chop, I tell myself make a chop. E lá temos a referencialidade estabelecida por reflexividade. Mas uma coisa muito interessante, que tenho que pensar um pouco nisso. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado. Bom, eu sou sociólogo, então talvez a minha pergunta seja um pouquinho básica, mas eu fiquei com a dúvida, você falou sobre as línguas criolhas e sobre o pidgin. Qual é a diferenciação entre o pidgin e o criolho? É uma questão linguística, ou é política, ou social, ou geográfica, ou...
Agora, na África Ocidental temos uma confusão dos nomes das línguas, Nigerian Pidgin, Ghanaian Pidgin, Pichi, e, digamos, a emergência, o processo de emergência dessas línguas. Todas essas línguas, todas essas variedades vêm do crioulo, que era uma língua muito bem estabelecida em Sierra Leone e importado, não sabemos tudo sobre a história, mas importado da Jamaica. Então, já formada como língua inteira. Agora, na literatura, sei que tem essa ideia do cycle, Pidgin Creole Cycle. Então, normalmente, um crioulo, uma língua crioula, é uma língua que emerge de um processo de reestruturação muito intensa e também falantes simplificam estruturas e tudo isso. O problema é que no Caribe e na África Ocidental não temos muita evidência para a fase Pidgin. E no Caribe não temos nenhuma evidência para uma fase Pidgin. Nenhuma. Pelo menos nas línguas nas variedades do African Caribbean English Creole. E por isso é muito contestado. No Pacífico é diferente, sim. O Papua New Guinean Tok-Pisin, Bislamá, o crioulo de Solomon Islands, sabemos pela evidência histórica que tem que ter tido um processo de pidginização. Mas não no Atlântico. Muito fraco a evidência. Quase não existe.
Bom, obrigado. Tá funcionando assim, né? É. Então, Kofi, eu gostei muito dessa apresentação, mas eu tenho eu queria saber uma dúvida diacrônica. Em termos você falou sobre o processo de transferência de crioulo de Jamaica para... quando que isso aconteceu, aproximadamente?
Agora, lá mesmo, eu vou mostrar o slide lá. Talvez aqui. Tem duas versões. Uma, sobretudo o nosso colega Ian Hancock, que propôs, é que o crioulo, a língua antecedente ao crioulo, emergiu em Sierra Leone, na costa da Sierra Leone. E depois foi exportado com o tráfico de africanos à América. Foi exportado uma versão já feita, desenvolvida da África até o Caribe. E depois voltou com maroons, com quilombolas jamaicanos em 1794. Houve uns 1.000, 2.000 jamaicanos que negociaram com o governo colonial da Jamaica de voltar para a África durante as guerras entre os quilombos de Jamaica do interior e o governo colonial. E como foram fundadores, se pode dizer, num período quando Freetown, a capital de Sierra Leone, não era muito poblada e estabeleceram um precedente linguístico. Os outros grupos que vieram adotaram também uma grande parte dessa gramática já feita, já estabelecida, como em todos os outros contextos, quando tem gente que já está lá e outros novos imigrantes que vêm. Então, isso é a história... digamos, que mexe as duas versões extremas. Aí, outra extrema é que não houve nada como língua de contacto com base lexical inglesa e foram os jamaicanos que trouxeram o sistema inteiro da Jamaica.
De lá para cá. Entendi. Não, então, muito legal isso, assim, que aí temos uma cronologia, assim, um momento de surgimento ali para depois a expansão posterior. Então, assim, é basicamente a virada do século XVIII para o século XIX, você está falando, né?
E a partir de Freetown, agora houve um movimento de migrações, micro-migrações de comunidades criou de Freetown, que implantaram agora as variedades do crioulo, necessidades coloniais emergentes da costa. Não?
Uhum. É.
Accra, Douala, Lagos, Port Harcourt.
Entendi. Não, bem interessante. Então, na verdade, todos esses, assim, então de certa forma, todas essas outras variedades, né, do pidgin, né, da Gana, nigeriana, pichi, eles são todos posteriores a essa fase.
Posteriores.
Todos posteriores.
Todos posteriores.
É.
Na literatura se encontra também, o Nigerian Pigeon já tem antecedentes ou já emergiu no século XV, XVI. Não.
Tá,
Tem variedades de inglês reestruturado, claro. No escrito também, tem africanos que escreveram nessas línguas e se pode investigar. Por exemplo, começantes. Se diz começantes? Não.
Comerciantes?
Sim.
Comerciantes,
Comerciantes. Que fizeram o bookkeeping em inglês e que escreveram diaries e essas coisas.
Entendi.
E, claro, não são variedades de inglês de língua primeira, não?
Sim.
Mas de língua segunda, segunda língua. Mas não são variedades que têm algo a ver com o crioulo.
Entendi. Tá. Não, então eu ia só fazer assim, uma pequena, assim, uma mini crítica do mapa que você fez lá do seu criolosfero, assim. Um pouco baseado nessa questão das cronologias. Porque você fez, assim, de fato ele existe, mas eu ia falar que ali onde você pega a parte norte do Brasil, exatamente, essa região.
Sim, ok.
Aí eu ia comentar que a presença de português nessa região no norte do Brasil, né, ou seja, a parte que vai de Maranhão para dentro, ali, de novo, a presença de português nessa região, nas estruturas do português brasileiro, eles são muito mais recentes, no sentido de que até meados do século XVIII também quase não tinha falantes de português nesta região, de nenhuma forma. Aí tem uma mudança muito grande a partir de 1750. Tem muitos africanos que vão para essa região.
Mas no Suriname, sim.
Sim, no Suriname não. No Suriname não. Eu estou só falando dessa região lá do Brasil.
Não, é verdade. E não é um mapa... Não olhe para o detalhe dessa mapa. Não é um mapa. É uma ideia.
Não, mas eu concordo que isso existe, mas é até uma questão de
cronologia. Mas é interessante esta questão do português, porque foi falado naturalmente em Suriname e antes do norte do Brasil. E houve um impacto enorme sobre as línguas crioulas do Suriname.
Eu achei muito interessante nessa questão, só para terminar, essa questão do fu e tu. Porque assim, se você pega o inglês do século XV, as duas estruturas são presentes,
for to, exatamente.
Na Inglaterra todos foram para tu, aqui não.
Exatamente, também os usos modais do fu. Obrigado.
Thank you very much for this really interesting talk. So I don't understand all of the Brazilian, so I hope I don't ask the question which was already asked. But a follow-up on this one. So you said for the African languages there is you cannot really make out the pidgin face. So it's in contrast, for the African varieties. So could you see with the Atlantic Creoles, could you see a difference with respect to the modality in grammaticalization terms? That these particles are more grammaticalized than like in Africa or something?
So they are more grammaticalized in the African varieties. Yes, but the question is, are we dealing with grammaticalization or just semantic copying and calking? Whatever came to Africa came back from the Caribbean would have contained the seeds of these subjunctive constructions, because in Jamaican we still have them, although they're much more limited. There could have been a re-expansion, or it could have been an expansion in the first place. So I'm presenting an image that is a bit idealizing in the sense that I'm pretending as if there's a chronological thing there going on, but it might not be the case. It might be that we had fragments of the subjunctive use, maybe in directives, make we go, mekatok, make in pragmatically very intense, directives, which are kind of interactive oriented, and then you get it in the more abstract syntactic, I told him to do, and right? For me, it's quite clear that these structures emerged in the more pragmatically oriented structures, directives, cohortatives, let's do something, right? That would be the site for me for the. So it could be that actually the Caribbean Creoles never had more than they already have now. So maybe I'm actually just speculating that there's been the kind of loss of these more African features while they've just remained the same. We don't know. But in some cases, we have evidence that the make constructions are more archaic. It's older speakers who use them versus younger, right? But we don't really need grammaticalization, because when you are speaking languages that use these structures and all the African speakers are highly multilingual, they just need to calc and copy. They don't really have to grammaticalize anything, right? There can still be a process of grammaticalization. You have phonological erosion and these kind of things, which is normal. So in that sense, the grammaticalization would just be limited to the kind of formal aspect, but not so much the semantic aspects. Yeah. Thank you.
So now we move forward. Yeah. Yes,
this.
because of the. But then we have to speak like.
Not as good as Kofi, because I
problem.
will go like this.
So we move to our second talk of the day. So just to endorse the pleasure that we have to have you all here. Now we have Professor Suzanne Fischer, who will be giving us the lecture Natural Language Change in Contact Settings, the case of Judeo-Spanish. I will read a brief introduction of Suzanne Fischer, so that we, as we did with Kofi. And so Suzanne Fischer is a full professor of Spanish and Catalan linguistics at the University of Hamburg. Her research interests span comparative diachronic syntax, language change, especially contact-induced change, syntactic theory, and interface phenomena. Among her significant works are the Catalan clitic system, a diachronic perspective on its syntax and phonology and word order change as a source of grammaticalization. She has also co-edited volumes such as the Manual of Grammatical Interfaces in Romance, Definiteness Effects, Bilingual, Typological, and Diachronic Variation, as well as Agreement Restrictions. And Suzanne Fischer has contributed extensively to the field with publications in renowned journals and books, including Diachronica, Letras, Linguistische Berichte, working papers of Scandinavian syntax, and typological studies in language. And her current project, which is going to be exploring today, funded by the DFG, investigates Judeo-Spanish is spoken in Bulgaria. So, Suzanne, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. So I hope I can do this, but usually I go like this. So if you don't understand me, then please just make a sign or give me a sign. So I'm going to talk about Judeo-Español. I call it Judeo-Spanish, but I only talk about the Bulgarian variety of Judeo-Spanish. So even though sometimes I don't say Bulgarian, but it's always about the variety that is spoken in Bulgaria. So I give you some social historical background later on, but for now just this variety of Spanish, or however we want to call it, as a lot of people say it's just a contact language. Not just, it's a contact language. It has nothing to do with Spanish. Some say it's like Old Spanish. There is no difference to the structure and syntax of Old Spanish. Some say it's a language which belongs to the Balkan Sprachbund. So also this, it has been said. And it has a lot of different names. So you find Judesmo, Judeo-Español, Ladino, Sephardi, Españolid, and many, many, many others. So this is what it looks like. ¿Qué hacían nuestros padres en los tiempos que no había ni radio ni televisión y que el uso de los sefardíes era de pasar la noche adentro de casa con la familia y con los vecinos? Uno de los divertimentos los más populares de aquellos tiempos era el de sentir las narraciones de cuentos y consejas. So I'm sure that you can understand this. Okay, what do the people did in the old times? They stayed home and they talked to each other about stories, cuentos populares, so fairy tales. And thinking about the nice things in life. So one of my favorite people is Elias Canetti. If you don't know his books, please read them. For linguists, these are the most wonderful books there are, and especially the first of his volumes of his biography is Die gerettete Zunge. He wrote in German, even so he grew up speaking Bulgarian, Judeo-Español. He only learns German very late, and he learned it, actually it's Austrian, he learned it in Austria. And he wrote the book on his childhood in Ruskov, where he was born, in Bulgaria. And so what he says is, to each other my parents spoke German, which I was not allowed to understand. To us children, to all relatives and friends, they spoke Ladino. The true vernacular, albeit an Asian Spanish, I often heard afterwards, and which I have never forgotten. So Elias himself says it's Old Spanish. It's an old version of Spanish. And this is like the literature people writing books in Judeo-Español, they say, okay, it's Old Spanish. If you look at the linguistic people, so you have different views. The ones I told you before, some say it's much closer to Old Spanish, some say it's 15th century. Gabinski, Penny says it has been preserved the same for the last 500 years. And then you have Schwarzwald. She says it's affected, it's a contact language, which you can see not only in the phonology, but also in the vocabulary. And then Friedman and Bryan, they are the ones who say it's Balkan Sprachbund. So what we find in Judeo-Spanish, and that's what I want to do with you today, is show you Judeo-Spanish has features of Old Spanish. It has features which are very similar to Bulgarian, and it has features which are not comparable to Old Spanish and not comparable to Bulgarian. And these are the ones I'm interested in, because these are the ones that you find in all the other varieties of Spanish. So what we see there is some kind of grammaticalization, some kind of natural processes of language change. So the feature of Old Spanish is stylistic fronting. Tapado fuera, yo en un museo. So you find this in Old Spanish very often. You also find it in Icelandic. It's a construction that appears in, apparently, I don't believe this, but in symmetric verb second languages. Then you have the innovative features similar to Bulgarian, clitic doubling. So you double the full pronouns. That's obligatory in Spanish. You can also double the datives. Apparently, it's optional. And in Bulgarian Spanish, you can also double the accusatives. So, la hija Asina la llamó a la madre después de 40 días. And these are the ones that are the same, like in the all varieties of Spanish. So this is clitic placement. You find them in initial position. You find them always in front of the finite verb. And you find optional clitic climbing. And that's very different to Old Spanish. And that's also very different to Bulgarian, because Bulgarian doesn't have clitic climbing. Okay, so what I want to show you is that we have, I'm too fast, I know, but you can read. No, okay. What I want to do today is to discuss these archaic and some of the innovative features that are located. They are actually located at the interfaces, and they are between syntax and information structure. So these are the stuff which is vulnerable. But in order to explain it, it doesn't help just to refer to the interfaces, what a lot of people did. You also have to look at the equivalence restrictions, equivalence patterns, so similar patterns in the two languages. What already Weinreich said, 53, and a lot of people after him took up. So you need both things. And then, and this for me is the most interesting, is that even in these contact settings, when you have language contact for 500 years, you find natural we find natural language change, so processes of natural language change. And this happens in the syntax. And that's what I want to show you. But if you believe me, I can stop here. And then we go for the coffee. Okay, so this is the structure. Okay, so the promised historical context. So the first Jewish people came from the north of Africa via Gibraltar to the Iberian Peninsula around the 4th century. With the invasion of the Arabs and the beginning of the Moorish Spanish, what we find there is that we have really a modus vivendi, that we have Muslims, Jewish people, Christian living together in harmony. So they were not persecuted, nothing at all. This only started with the Catholics. Okay, so with the advancing of, and that's why I don't call it Reconquista, it's Conquista actually, because Christians weren't there before, even though it's called Reconquista, so that's why it's in brackets. Then it really starts the first riots, violent riots against Jews, so they started 1391, and this led already to the emigration of a great number of Jews. So the expulsion decree of the Reyes Católicos, so they kicked them out. This was in 1492, and it deteriorated the conditions for the Jews dramatically. So they could choose either to become Christians and stay in the country, or they had to leave. If they left, of course, they had to leave everything behind. So they had to go without anything. So some of them stayed and became conversos. And the nice thing about this is, and I also recommend this to you, there's a very nice cooking book of these Jewish people pretending to be conversos Christians. So they put some pork in the oven and roasted this, and made their own food out of aubergine. Bedisha. So, and it looked like chuletas, so like cutlets, but it was not. It was vegetarian, or it was lamb or whatever. So it had nothing to do with the porks. It's a very nice cooking book. So they were kicked out, and then some of them went to Portugal, some of them went to the Netherlands, some of them went to France, to Italy, to the north of Africa, and also a lot of them went to Brazil. And from Brazil, some of them went to the Aruba, Curaçao, and Bonaire. So, and apparently they were the ones who were the first to start papiamento, to speak it. There's a letter from a Jewish guy who wrote to in papiamento. So I don't know whether this is true. You are the expert on this, but I just came across it, and not now, like some time ago. Most of the Sephardic Jews, they went to the Ottoman Empire, and just to show you, this is what it looked like. So it's all Serbian, Bulgarian, Greece, everything there. So we find some people, lots of people living, not anymore a lot, but some there. Yeah, they had they could live there, have their culture, their language, their traditions, and they were not bothered. So it was good living there. So with the Atatürk movement in Turkey, the prestige of the Judeo-Spanish speakers declined, and then after World War II, a lot of them emigrated to Israel, but also to other countries. We have a big group of Judeo-Spanish speakers in Istanbul. So, yeah. Also, I find this very funny, or not funny, very strange actually. So we find the Sephardic Jews, and I met them, I talked to them a lot, so they love Spain. They talk about Spain, this wonderful country and everything. But if you ask them, so have you ever been there? Did you visit? They say, no, I would not. So, and El País had an article on this in 2014. So, homesick for Spain, but not in order to return, not even for a visit. So, the Jews were multilingual already, like in the already then. So they were the translators to translate Arabic texts into Spanish texts, or also into Latin. And Hebrew, they knew Hebrew, of course, also. So after the expulsion, they were scattered among many nations, and they acquired or learned the language of the countries they lived in. So, but also retained the Spanish. So what we find in Bulgaria now is a Spanish which has been kept for 500 years, more than 500 years. So this interesting thing is which grammatical domains remain stable, which are not changed under the influence of the contact language, which grammatical domain tend to change, converge on the contact language. Are there limits to convergence? We know there are, but how can we explain it? And what happens with those domains that are argued to remain stable in contact settings? So, we have many different theories. I don't go into them, but just to tell you, so there is Thomas and Kaufmann, which is for the sociologists the most interesting, because, and also my students love this theory. They think it's the best. And why do we need any other theory? This explains everything. So, and it says, I call the theory anything goes, because they don't restrict anything. So according to Thomas and Kaufmann, and I liked them very much, and I also liked the book and all the texts of them, they say everything can be borrowed, everything can be transferred, or everything, you have substratum influence everything. So they have these two different processes, but the main argument, the main hypothesis, it's the social-linguistic history of the speakers and not the structure of their language that is the primary determinant of the linguistic outcome of language contact. So then we have Heini Kuteva. They say it's more complicated, of course, but I just cut it short. So they say you need equivalence restrictions. So you need a pattern in the other language which you recognize from your own language, and then you can transfer it. Or what happens then is grammaticalization. And then we have, which has been discussed controversially a lot, but a lot of people like it a lot. It's Suraj's interface hypothesis, which actually goes back to Christa Blatzak. He said he had this idea at a conference, and he said that narrow syntax is less vulnerable than interface syntax, and he was referring to first language acquisition, so that kids, first what they learn is the syntax, and only after a very long time they know pragmatics, information structure. I suppose you all know this. If you talk to kids and you tell them a joke, you try to be ironic, no way, it doesn't work. So, and then they have this face when they always tell these stupid jokes and laugh their head off, but until they get the real pragmatic stuff, this takes a long time. And so you have, and then you have the version 1, narrow syntax is less vulnerable than interface syntax, and then you have the version 2, the grammar external interfaces are less vulnerable than the internal one. So this is just to give you an overview. It's from my colleague Christoph, who is also in the project. We work together. So, and he shows it like this. You have the internal interfaces and the external Schnittstellen interfaces. The one between phonology and phonetics is always influencing each other, and pragmatics and information structure is very vulnerable. So I'll leave this. We go back to this later. Just a little bit about the data. So we started out looking at texts that have been written. So we looked at Para que no se olvide. This is a textbook really written by the Bulgarian Judeo-Spanish speakers. And in the front, so in the beginning, the introduction tells you, okay, there is no standard orthography. We try to do the orthography similar to each other, but it doesn't really work because the phonology is different of each of the speakers, and also the syntax and the morphology. We try to keep each story as it was told by the speaker. So we have in this book 23 different speakers, and so we have a little bit something which we would call spoken language. I know it's not spoken language, but of course it's a start. Letra Antonio Saura is actually French Judeo-Spanish. We took it anyway in order to see, because this is criticizing that the people lose the Judeo-Spanish, that they don't use it anymore. So we took this because we thought, okay, if they complain that the young people don't speak it properly anymore, then they might use structures which you don't find in the modern versions. So that's why we took this one. And then we have El Principico, the Little Prince. And this is a standardized Judeo-Spanish, which is like a combination of all different varieties so that everyone could read it. So we started out with this, and we looked for certain structures. Then on the basis of what we found there, we did a grammaticology judgment task, so which we tried with not a lot of speakers. You see later how many we had. In 2012, 2014, there's always a summer school there, which I attended several times in 2016. And there is also a phonology prosody rhythm studies. I don't talk about phonology today, and not ever. My colleagues do this, and they do this very well, so I would not like to compete with them. So, then we went back. Since we have this project, we went back there and we gathered new data. We had interviews, experimental data for the phonology group. They need special stuff in order to see whether there's vowel raising or not. And Jorge and me, who do the morphosyntax stuff, we wanted to see whether these old structures of Old Spanish are still there and stuff like this. So we gave them translation tasks to brine them so that they should use it. And funny enough, they used some of it, but they totally ignored others, which they just translated differently, which was very nice. So it was a good result. And then, of course, they have to tell the personal language history. So you see, we don't have a lot of speakers. All in all, in the meantime, there are only about 30 speakers. We have found almost all of them, so you are connected. They're very old. The nice thing about this is, there's something missing. Yeah. So the nice thing is so the first generation we interviewed in 2012, 2014. And this is we call them Generation Yvette. She's one of the best speakers. Now she's dead. And this generation, they were their grandparents. So we have 3 natural generations, one after the other, and we can actually see how the Judeo-Spanish changes from the first generation to the last generation, which is very, very nice. Okay, so we looked at syntax, narrow syntax, clitic distribution, clitic placement. We looked at clitic climbing because there is no semantics in there and no information structure. We looked at syntax semantic information structure, clitic doubling, and we looked at syntax information structure, stylistic fronting. And we used this in order to see what has changed from Old Spanish, what is different compared to Old Spanish, to Modern Spanish, to Bulgarian, and to the other varieties of Spanish, because we wanted to see what is contact and what is natural language change. So, don't be afraid, I don't tell you a lot about Wackernakel position or Tuplo Musafia, just you Brazilians don't have clitics anymore, so, which is a pity, I think, but nevertheless. So this Wackernakel law, it just says that clitic elements, these phonologically and syntactically reduced elements, are not allowed to stay in the first position. They have always to appear in the second position. And then we have the Romance version of this, and this is the Tuplo Musafia, and it just says clitics are not allowed to appear in initial position. So that's the whole thing. So, and that's what you see in Old Spanish. So I marked the clitics for you in red. So you see, esto le dare aquí ante el rey Don Alfonso, the clitic is not in first position. If the clitic would appear in first position, it's the verb which is moved in front of the clitic or the clitic after the verb, I don't mind. And so you have these physolotreia presso, so you have it then afterwards. Bulgarian is exactly like Old Spanish, actually. It shows a toplomusafia, even so for Slavic language, one thinks it's Wackernagel. So, but they appear also further down, but you see they never appear in initial position. So, Judeo-Spanish, you have them in first position, there's no problem, always. This is just normal. So, so what we see is Judeo-Spanish allows clitic elements to be in sentence initial position. Even so, narrative inversion, sometimes you find some exceptions, but you also find them in Spanish. So here you already see it's not like Bulgarian and it's not like Old Spanish. And we say they fled before, usually it's said that these Jews fled before the 16th century. But I made sure, I say Old Spanish, but I checked all the stuff I tell you here is up to the 17th century. So they have already been in Bulgaria, and still the Old Spanish used post-verbal clitics with finite verbs and never clitics in initial position. So another thing which is very prominent in Old Spanish is interpolation. You could separate the clitic from the finite verb. So, lo non fallamos, this is perfect. You could even separate it with a negation. So, according to Kane and other generative people, this shows that the little thing is not a head, but it's a phrase. Bulgarian also does not allow interpolation. That's what you find in the standard grammars. But if you look at Boskovic and Stephen Franks, they tell you Bulgarian allows some kind of interpolation, which actually helps my argument. So, this clitic distribution, in none of the texts we didn't find a single interpolation. So there's no interpolation. So really different to Old Spanish and maybe, according to Boskovic and Stephen Franks, also to Bulgarian. Clitic climbing. The modern Romance languages show clitic climbing. So you can have the clitic either with the modal verb, or you have it with the infinitive. So, te lo quiero dártelo. No problem. You can have both. In Old Spanish, and also in Old French and Old Catalan, even so, which is interesting because French doesn't allow it anymore. You can only have it with modals. It was obligatory. So, the clitic had to stay with the finite verb, with the modal. So, it always climbed up. And this was, till the 17th century, it was the norm, more or less. So more clitics up than down. I have percentages later. Bulgarian doesn't have an infinitive, so you cannot have these sequences of verbs. You always need a complementizer in between. So no clitic lining. Judeo-Spanish, quiero escribirte en te quiero escribir. You find both. In the text, no problem. So clitic climbing also, it's optional, it's different from Old Spanish, and it's different from Bulgarian. Clitic doubling. So I had a project on clitic doubling for some time, and we looked at the diachronic development of clitic doubling. And it starts really out with the doubling of the full pronouns, so what you see in 14. Yo les fis saber a ellos, so, but it was optional. So you didn't need to double it. So you could double it, but you didn't need to double it. And then it starts sometime in the 17th century with datives. So, a medianoche les dije a las camaradas. And you find it, apparently according to Real Academia Española, it's optional that you can have it with the datives. Le doy el libro a Pedro. You need it with psych verbs. A mí me gusta, there you really have to double, but with the others, you don't need to. Okay. Bulgarian, you have multiple agreement, and some people, Friedman and Brian, also Compensis, they call it clitic doubling because it is clitic doubling. So you have these clitics, and they can be doubled. So the teacher called him the boy. So you see the it, it's the accusative, and it doubles the boy. And in 18, you see the teacher is missing an H, that the boy gave the book to her, the teacher, so it's doubled. And, sorry, I don't have an example here, but they also double inanimates. So the accusative does not have to be inanimate. So in Judeo-Spanish, like in other Spanish varieties, you find clitic doubling, and you find it also with accusatives. So, Yildiz dijo además que mi tía Becca la ayudó a parir a su madre, and you also have la hija Athena la llamó a la madre después de 40 días. So you have it doubled with the accusative and with the dative, and the difference to Bulgarian, it only doubles animate accusatives. So stylistic fronting, just to show these two, you have stylistic fronting in Old Spanish. It can, and I don't talk about these topicalization to the left or topicalization to the right. That's not what I talk about. It's really that you have a past participle or an adjective that is moved in front of the finite verb. So that's what is the definition for the stylistic fronting. So, que forzado a de ser mejor que todos los padres. Forzado a, you have the past participle in front of the finite verb, and that is what you have a lot in Old Spanish. In the modern Spanish varieties, you don't find this anymore. So, Bulgarian has the same thing. It would not be stylistic fronting. Savoia analyzes it as remnant movement, but we don't need to go into this. But what you see is that you have the past participle in front of the finite verb. So this is clearly an equivalence. So according to Kuteva and Heine, the Judeo-Spanish speakers see the structure and say, oh, we can keep it because we have it in our language too. Judeo-Spanish in the Letra Antonio Saura, and also in A que no se olvide, we found this structure. Antonio va triste de corazón, triste va de corazón in Letra. And in A que no se olvide, interesante es la historia de mi mamá. So you find it, the adjectives or the past participle in front of it. So we have Judeo-Spanish, has innovative features like modern Spanish. It shows clitic placement, like modern Iberian Spanish, and also like the other varieties. You have clitics in first position, and you have it in front of the finite verb and following infinitives. You have no interpolation, it's not attested, and clitic climbing is optional. So this is like modern Spanish, not like Old Spanish. You have Judeo-Spanish, the clitic doubling, like in Bulgarian. So with the accusatives, you also find this in Buenos Aires, in Lima, in Patagonia, in a lot of areas where you have contact with other languages. Also in the Basque Country, you find this type of doubling. And then you have La llamo a la madre, la pinté, la casa. And they also do it, la pinté, la casa, also with the accusatives, inanimate accusatives. This is La Pinté, La Casa is from Patagonia. It's Mario's example. He says stuff like this. So, Judeo-Spanish, the archaic stuff is the stylistic fronting, triste va de corazón. So that's what we found. And then we did the grammaticality judgment tasks. So this was 2012, as I said. We have 5 bilingual speakers, Bulgarian, Judeo-Spanish. They were at that time, in the meantime, as you see, they're older, or dead, age 80 to 88, and they were born in different cities, and they were living in Sofia since 1947, 1950, so they moved to there. They all have an academic background, and they said, the oldest people of them, they said that they spoke Judeo-Spanish not only as a family language, they grew up with this as the first language, they also spoke it in the neighborhood. So going outside the house, they spoke Judeo-Spanish. The next generation, which I show you data later, they said, okay, they only had it in the family. And the very last generation, the generation Moritz, they said they only spoke it to the grandparents. So that's the difference there. So we have different grammaticality judgment tasks, and we of course introduced distractors, so sentences which didn't test anything, where we added some mistakes like wrong words and stuff, which they very nicely corrected, and we also, in 2013, in between, we were there and we took a lot of notes because Jorge is very much interested in aspect. So how they use aspect, because they use it totally different from Bulgarian aspect and very different to the Spanish aspect. Okay, so, and they had to rate the sentence only with okay, not okay, do you say this, do you not say this, and then we introduced for them, not are you not sure, but we said, you don't say it, but do you know someone who would say this? And this was very nice because these old ladies then said, I would never speak like this, it's wrong, but she says this. And so this was very nice because we got data which usually they try to speak a correct Judeo-Spanish. And so then we also got data which they would not admit that they were using it. Since the ladies are very old, some of them are bad. have a bad eyesight, so we spoke to them. We went by foot through the grammatical judgment task, and a lot of this stuff, Elena Kiriva did it. She's a Bulgarian who speaks a very good Judeo-Spanish. So what we found is, without any problem, the clitic placement is exactly like Iberian Spanish, like all the other Spanish varieties. Optional clitic climbing, like Iberian Spanish, like all the other varieties. No interpolation, there's no interpolation, so didn't accept these sentences. All speakers, so the first two generations, Generation Yvette and Generation Sophie, accepted stylistic fronting. They said, yes, it's possible. It sounds a little bit poetic, but yes, in certain circumstances we could say this maybe. These are the ones with the book also, who wrote the stories in the book. All speakers allowed clitic doubling with accusatives and with datives anyway, and the quirky subjects, the psych verbs had to be doubled anyway, and they also allowed it with the accusatives, but only with animate accusatives. So it's different to Old Spanish. It's very similar to modern Spanish varieties. And it shows some archaisms. So phonologically, there's a lot of old stuff in there. The sibilants are like Old Spanish, but yeah. And we also have the stylistic fronting, which is present in Bulgarian. It shows innovation, the clitic doubling. However, it is only with animate accusatives. In Bulgarian, it's also with inanimate accusatives. And we have optional clitic climbing, which is not present in Bulgarian. So now the rest of the data, and it's not so very different. We find the clitic doubling, like in the text and in the first grammaticality judgment task. So we find the clitic doubling in the interviews, so when they were talking to us. Also in the translation tasks, but that's not so interesting. It's really, they spoke like this, so they used the clitic doubling without any problems. The stylistic fronting, they never used it. So in the interviews, you don't find, with this last generation, you don't find the stylistic fronting anymore. Never with the past participle. The only thing what they could do was interesantes. So the adjective works, but not the past participle. The clitic climbing, exactly like in the text and the grammaticality judgment tasks, and the clitic placement also exactly like in the text and the grammaticality judgment tasks. So just to show this again, so we have this clitic climbing, no lo quiero decir, cuando querían decirme, so on purpose I used the same modal, so there is no difference between the modals. They use it with the climbed clitic and with the clitic with the infinitive. And puedo adaptarme, and also me puedo adaptar. Here it even looks as if you have two clitics. Also here, esta cosa no se debe hacer. no debe hacerlo, no te puedo tocar, quiero decirte, nos pueden enviar. So you have it in both positions. If we now look at the Spanish varieties, this is the study by Davies, and here has Mark Davies, this big corpus of 3.5 million words of spoken and written Spanish text. And he, first of all, shows it's more a spoken thing, that you have the clitic climbing. And he did a variation by geographical regions. So the variation between these countries, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Cuba, Colombia, Peru, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Spain and Venezuela, so they all use both, and even the statistics are like very, very similar, so there's not a lot of difference. So it was the norm in Old Spanish. It's not allowed in modern Spanish. It was the norm in Old Spanish that the clitic has to appear with the finite verb. In modern Spanish, it's allowed in both positions. Bulgarian doesn't have an infinitive, so there's no way that it could be borrowed from Bulgarian. And all clitics in Bulgarian, they always have to appear with the finite verb. So it seems correct to suggest that the clitic climbing pattern in Judeo-Spanish is the result of natural language change. It cannot be something not from Old Spanish, could not be retained, and it is not due to contact. So clitic placement, interpolation, clitic climbing is narrow syntax. It has nothing to do with semantics. It has nothing to do with information structure. It's merge and move and the uninterpretable formal features of the computational system. Clitic doubling, clearly, you have to respect animacy, specificity. It has semantic features, and it also has information structural features. So has it been said before? What do you think is the other thinking? Is it specific or not? So, and then the stylistic fronting, the interface in syntax and information structure. So, Thomas and Kaufmann, anything goes. They cannot explain why, despite a strong cultural pressure for 500 years, only some syntactical features are borrowed and others not. So clitic pronouns appear in sentence initially. They do not appear in sentence initial position in Bulgarian, and never, so always with in second position or in third position. Heinekutiva equivalence relations explains the convergence on Bulgarian for clitic doubling and also for stylistic fronting, but it does not explain why clitic placement, clitic climbing developed according to modern Spanish and the modern varieties. Sorachi's interface hypothesis explains why some narrow syntax phenomena do not converge. Okay, that's narrow syntax on Bulgarian, and that clitic doubling does not seem so that, and that others like clitic doubling, which is an interface phenomenon, does converge on Bulgarian. However, as I said before, clitic doubling in Bulgarian is also allowed with inanimates, and this is not allowed in Judeo-Spanish, only with animates. And furthermore, Sorachi does not explain why some patterns at the interfaces are kept and others are lost. So, we need to combine things. So we would propose that Sorachi and all the other people working on the interfaces are correct in arguing that phenomena belonging to narrow syntax are less vulnerable, whereas phenomena applying at the interfaces are vulnerable in language acquisition, first and second language acquisition, and as such vulnerable in context settings. Being an element that applies at the interface is, however, not enough in order to be retained or innovated. Equivalence relations between the languages in context are relevant. So the archaic feature stylistic fronting changed the information structure in Old Spanish. Therefore, it's difficult to acquire in language acquisition. It's lost in standard Spanish. It can be kept in Judeo-Spanish because they see in Bulgarian a similar structure, even though the young generation doesn't use it anymore, not as the old generation. The innovative feature clitic doubling interface phenomena is vulnerable in language contact, expanded in Judeo-Spanish from datives to accusatives. It's very similar to Bulgarian, but it looks more like an overgeneralization of the pattern that was already there, so the dative doubling. And also not really language contact. Narrow syntax, natural processes of language change, the clitic distribution. The change can be explained by grammaticalization, so a face changes to a head and then to 5 features in with datives, which has been argued for a long time, and that's why they do not allow interpolation anymore, and that's why they can appear. They are not tabula musafia clitics anymore. So it's no change of the semantics, but a mere change of the categorical status of the pronouns. Clitic climbing in modern Spanish is head movement. Maybe I should say, I don't think that this is the case, but it's the easiest explanation, and we haven't come up with a good explanation for clitic climbing yet. No one has. So it said that in Old Spanish, the reason why it was like obligatory was it was some kind of phrasal movement, and that's what we can see that it was interpolated. And in modern Spanish, it's not. It's no face. So because you also have stuff like que esta nuestra vendida quisiera incrementar haya la ira de Dios. So there are limits to convergence and limits to optionality, even at the interfaces. The structure of the language in contact are important. Phenomena structures at the interfaces are vulnerable. Converging on or retaining structures where equivalent patterns are available in the contact language. However, often it's only the extension of an existing pattern. We have to think about this. So it shows that even in contact settings, the structures belonging to narrow syntax undergo natural process of language change. We have to be very, very careful what we claim is according to contact and what is just in the languages. And one of the main arguments in favor of this view is the fact that Judeo-Spanish concerning these, and I only showed you 3 of these phenomena, are different to Bulgarian but identical to 10 other varieties of Spanish all over the world. So, and I think this is a strong indicator for internal change due to natural processes of language change. And then I also finish. So this is the narrow syntax phenomena. So you see initial clitics not up to the 17th century in Spain. Bulgarian doesn't allow it in 10 varieties of Spanish, the ones Davis looked at, and I also looked at the different languages, and also in Bulgarian Spanish. Tabula musafia is active in Old Spanish and Bulgarian Spanish. It's not active in the 10 varieties of Spanish and not in Bulgarian Spanish. Postverbal clitics with the finite verb, the tabula musafia pattern, Old Spanish and Bulgarian, but not in the varieties of Spanish, not in Bulgarian Spanish. Interpolation, it was in Old Spanish. So the brackets are for Boscovich and Stephen Franks and the standard grammar. You don't find it in the other varieties, and the clitic climbing more than 70% up to the 17th century. It was 85 in the 16th century, and does not exist in Bulgarian, but is optional in Bulgarian and in the other varieties. So thank you very, very much. So these are the speakers. They meet in the Club Ladino, talking to each other in Judeo-Spanish. So you see they're very old. You have to either ask in English or some of you have to translate it for me.
Okay, so thank you very much for the talk. I am really interested in Jewish languages in general, so it was especially interesting for me. I would like to ask you if you have any information about this kind of syntactic changes that took place in the other variety of Judaism, or in Hagetiya in Morocco, because I think it would be very interesting to see how the contact with Arabic and other languages could impact the situation.
Very good question. Unfortunately, people working on Judeo-Spanish don't do a lot of syntactic stuff, so we are almost the first to really look into syntax. But of course, we looked at the text, and what we found is that there is a huge difference concerning semantics. So aspect is very different in the Judeo-Spanish spoken in Israel, the Judeo-Spanish spoken in Istanbul. But clitic placement seems to be the same, so there is no difference. So, but we don't know a lot of this, so we applied for this project again. So these were the first 3 years, and for the next session, what we want to do is also look into Judeo-Spanish in Istanbul and Judeo-Spanish in Israel, and there are some speakers left in France, and apparently some in Romania.
Some in Brazil as well?
In Brazil as well, yes. Oh, yeah. Tell me where they are, and we will investigate them.
I know some people who speak Hakatia here in São Paulo. Yeah, they are really old, but I know they are like first language speakers.
Oh, perfect. So we have another project.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was wondering about the issue that you've got modern features, or let's say features shared with modern varieties of Spanish, also in Ladino, and I thought maybe like of some more sociological explanation that's not related to contact, because these people are very highly mobile. Since they got kicked out of Spain in the 15th century, they moved around quite a lot, and they had very extended families. Like they went to South America, they went back, they went to Italy, they went to France, they were in the Netherlands, they had their cousins in Amsterdam, some went to the Ottoman Empire. So they would have been in touch probably throughout the centuries with speakers of modern Romance languages and of Latin American varieties. So maybe the Spanish just is not that archaic, like they developed together with the other Romance languages. They would have speakers of Italian, of modern Italian, modern French, modern varieties of Spanish through multilingualism and their family networks and trade networks. So maybe if it's not like inherited from Old Spanish and it's not a feature of contact with Bulgarian, maybe it's just like a general drift across Romance languages that they accompanied by living in Europe and speaking all these languages.
No, this is exactly what I would say. Oh. It's not from Old Spanish.
Yeah.
The only thing from Old Spanish is the stylistic fronting, and this is actually getting lost now. So the last generation, it's fast the young generation, but they are 60, 70, they are old, so they don't really use it anymore. And the other thing, you are right, this is always very critical, because of course they are academic people, so they speak a lot of languages. So they do not only speak Bulgarian and Judeo-Spanish, most of them actually speak French. And this is an argument for us, because French does not allow the clitic climbing stuff, only with causatives. And French is a little different. So, but I think it's exactly a general drift. What you see in all the Spanish varieties, that there are some things. It doesn't matter if you go to Lima and they are in contact with Quechua, or you go to Mexico where they are in contact to Nahuatl, or to a lot of other indigenous languages. You see that the Spanish does the same stuff. So it looks all very similar. So this presentation was just a lot of people. I mean, there's this old fight: can languages mix? Can languages not mix? Of course, they can mix. And during these last years, it was always only about language contact. So to show what did they take from other languages. So, and I think it's actually more interesting to look what do you find as natural language process in spite of the contact that you see and is there. So that's the thing. Yeah, but
yeah, like maybe aren't there two processes, like natural, like something internal that's like from the language, but also something which is being in touch with other varieties of the same family, right? Like speaking Italian, for example, and then accompanying the same drifts as like related languages, which is maybe not so natural, but it's also sociological, no? Like
okay. So what you mean is that they speak other Romance languages, and that's why they get these kind of similarities. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I mean, mine is only the linguistic perspective. So Gilberto will talk about all the social and cultural context stuff. Yeah, maybe I showed you only now the clitic stuff because I think this is the most obvious, but we also looked at null subjects, which goes then into, this is also semantics and information structure again. And there you see a huge difference between the different Judeo-Spanish varieties. So these ones, they actually use a lot of overt subjects, and it looks as if they become a verb second language. They don't like to have the subject in the first position. They put always some interjection, something before it. So, but we are not very far with this. So, yeah, we looked at aspects, we looked at null subjects, we looked at this kind of stuff. So we looked at a lot of different features. Yeah, and yeah, of course, I mean, I make it easy for myself. I'm a syntactician, so I say, okay, his story is interesting, but other people should do it. So, but that's why we start this project here, that we come together and discuss this kind of stuff with reference to sociology and cultural contact and social linguists. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, we've seen narrow syntax features across the whole discussion, like merger move events happening with clitic placement. But what about post-spell out features and phenomena, like morphological information and prosody? Do they somehow relapse into your data? When we try, for example, to reach a definition for Judeo-Spanish?
Of course, there is some morphological stuff and spell-out stuff which is very, very interesting, but yeah, I didn't look at this. So this is Jorge's work. So Jorge Vega Villanova, I work together with him. He's doing the phonologies part. And it's a kind of a big project, so we are it's in 4 different universities, in Saarbrücken, in Mainz, in Hamburg. No, not 4 universities, but 4 parts. We look at the phonology of Bulgarian, the phonology of Judeo-Spanish. We look at the syntax, morphology of Bulgarian and of Judeo-Spanish, and we compare the stuff and we look what has been taken from Bulgarian. There, of course, we also look at morphological stuff. Yes, of course.
Okay, thank you.
Any other last question?
Right, thank you. I have more of a curiosity question. Is there something like a Judeo-Catalan? Because I was thinking that a cool property about the morphophonology of Catalan clitics is that they are sensitive to whether they are pre or post-verbal, and they have also a larger repertoire of pronouns, like weak pronouns and those things that are difficult to learn when you're learning Catalan. So my question goes like whether these differences, most morphophonological differences in Catalan would reflect to these contact phenomena regarding Judeo-Catalan.
So I answer for my colleague Jonas and Christoph, Jonas Krümke and Christoph Gabriel, and they actually found that the phonology is very adept of taking features of the contact language. So what they showed is with Bulgarian that they have really a Bulgarian phonology. So they have a vowel raising, for example, and the prosody changes. So that's very Bulgarian. And you are right, there is Judeo-Spanish, a Catalan Judeo-Spanish, an Italian Judeo-Spanish. I am very lucky because in Hamburg there's Michael Alevi, and he's a speaker of Judeo-Spanish, and he can change. It's not his mother tongue, but he learned it, and he has been studying it for 50 years. And he can change his Judeo-Spanish. He gives courses at the university, and he changes his Judeo-Spanish to make it more Italian or more Catalan or more Portuguese. And and he changes, when he changes this, he changes the phonology, he also changes the words, of course, so they use then different words. And also some part of the aspect stuff, it's also then different, yes. So Catalan, you know, they have this very strange periphrastic past tense, and stuff like this changes then, yes. Thank you.
So now we go. So thank you, Suzanne, so much. So
Thank
a
you.
round of applause. We go for a 15-minute break. So we circle back to this room at 4:20, and then we have our final lecture with Gilberto Recha on contact in sociology. Okay. So we start once again for the final talk of the day. This talk is going to be on the sociological aspects of contact. So I'm very much pleased with the possibility of exploring this branch of contact. And this will be given by Gilberto Reche, also from the University of Hamburg. He's a sociologist and coordinator of the Latin American Studies program at the University of Hamburg. His research focuses on diverse and interdisciplinary topics, including local politics, development, migration, transnational and translocal dynamics, as well as the study of indigenous and ethnic groups, gender issues, and qualitative methodologies. Reche holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Bielefeld and has conducted extensive ethnographic research in Mexico, Nicaragua, and the Philippines. His interest further encompasses decolonial perspectives, Southern sociology, and alternative approaches to development, making him a prominent contributor to Latin American and sociological studies. So the title of the talk is Familiarization to Borders as a Central Feature of Socially Minoritized Groups' Everyday Worlds. Thank you for being here as well, and the floor is yours.
Já ia falar português. Okay, thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. And I hope you won't be disappointed. I won't be speaking that much about languages. I'm just going to speak about, well, contact in the end. And I have to say, I had to add that contact would be like a side aspect of my topics. You know, I mainly work on, as you said, on minoritized groups like indigenous people, Afrodescendientes, and so on. And I'm interested in how this categorization works and how there are other alternative approaches to not categorize in a, I would say, in a northern style, yeah, having a more open idea. And there get this idea of borders, of boundaries, of contact in, yeah. And the other point is I'm very much interested in interactions, political interactions between those groups and states, and so I'm actually also looking at national discourses and so on. I'll show you. Well, and just maybe, so that was like my topics, but also to give, as you would say in Portuguese, my lugar da fala, my locus of enunciation. I'm in fact, my mother is Brazilian, my father is German. I grew up in Germany. My wife is Mexican. I've lived for a long time in Mexico. And so I guess also because of that, my interest arose in these constellations of moving around, of having contacts, of seeing diverse borders and so on, yeah. And well, and in the end, I grew up in Germany as a person that was in that time very different from other persons that grew up in Germany. Okay? Yeah. But I don't know about you, but I really grew up in a rural context, and maybe, okay, fine. Okay, so we should talk about that. Okay, fine. Well, okay, I better stand here. Okay, I give a brief overview. I don't know how much you are into social or cultural theories of contact and transfer and hybridization and so on, but just to point out some points. Normally in sociology, in classical European sociology, I'd say, contact situations are often seen as something that makes change. You have contact with another society, you have migration, you have mobility, whatever, you have development interventions, and then it's at least like a kind of catalysator for social change. And that obscured a bit that, of course, as you were saying about languages, you also have eternal elements of change. So social change is very common, and at the same time you have also a lot of aspects that are very stable, but normally sociologists focus on the things that are supposed to be changing. Well, and in that you can see, and that is also related with this idea of this external catalysator, that there's a strong container thinking. I would say that epistemologically spoken, this is, like I said before, a mode of northern thinking, like having closed boxes and focusing more on the boxes than on the aspects that are like transgressing the borders of these boxes. And especially as in sociology, that arose in a time when also nationalism or the idea of national states arose. It's very clear because normally you have this idea of national societies. So it's in the end really boxed. And so often societies, cultures, and so on, they are seen like boxed, and they are often attributed this idea of being pure and homogeneous and so on. Well, and I guess all of you know this concept by Nestor Garcia Canclini, this idea of hybridization, that was for a long time seen like as a way out of this problematic. But in the end, now you have especially decolonial thinkers that criticize even this as being too closed, too boxed in the end. But because if you take a careful look at Canclini, he also parts from the idea of having like maybe not so pure cultures, but you have these boxes, and then they mix and create new boxes and so on. And I would say the quest now would be to get rid of the boxes. But it's difficult, yeah? Okay. Okay, well, now, my position is more one of social constructivism that supposes that everything social and reality per se, as social reality, is constructed by social actors through social interaction. And so this, I'd call this negotiation, processes of negotiation, they are a basic feature of the social interaction. And well, I didn't put the names, but this idea related to Schütze, for example, or to Berger and Luckmann and so on, that you have, be it live words or everyday words, where we are located, and they are very much related to how we make sense, how we give meaning to what we see, what we say, and so on. So this means everything we do in this perspective would be based in knowledge systems. Knowledge, not as like a lexical idea of knowledge, but like everyday knowledge, knowledge that arises from our experience, because that's how we give sense, how it makes sense to us, what we see, what we talk about, and so on. Okay, and especially, maybe I could say I was trained in this idea and this approach, the interface approach, another kind of interface. And this is an approach where I should have started the way around. It became prominent with Norman Long, who was a sociologist who did studies in agricultural and in development interventions. And so he noticed that a lot of development, or mainly all development interventions failed. And he was wondering why. And then to put it simply, what he found out, or what he guessed, was that the knowledge systems do not fit between the development experts that are seen and legitimized as experts, the ones who know, who have the real knowledge, and the other ones who have to be taught how to do whatever in a development project. And so the interface, the social interface, it is in the interaction between diverse social actors, but it is per se an interface between the knowledge systems. And if they are not compatible, there will be like a discontinuity or at least an irritation and so on. Yeah? And that means, well, let's say the irritations in development projects are are far bigger than in day-to-day life. But what I would take from this is that per se it's like an ongoing negotiation of knowledge, of meanings and so on. Even now as we meet here, we'll have diverse ideas, and all the time we'll try to adapt to each other. We might not notice, but like a basic social feature would be that we would try to understand each other. Sometimes we just assume that we understand each other, though we don't. That's when problems arise. But if not, then it's like navigating all the time, negotiating all the time. Okay? And that would be, for me, a basic feature of social contact. Okay. Well, the dark side of contact maybe. So if we would put it like that, contact as a basic feature of social dynamics, of social change, and so on, of understanding each other due to getting closer in our knowledge systems, everything would be fine. But the problem is that then you have stereotypes in it, and you have power relations and so on. Like in the case of a development project, as I said, you have persons that are entitled to have the correct, the legitimate knowledge, and you have the ones who are not, or who are even not entitled to, are seen as having no knowledge. That's, so to say, we call the systems of ignorance. Yeah, they are attributed ignorance, but per se the ignorant person is, in that case, a development expert that cannot accept that the counterpart has knowledge. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the argument here is that especially you can see this in day-to-day interactions, that they are very stereotyped and so on, and that often, depending upon with whom you are treating, you are in a way reserved and so on. And by that, the borders, the social borders, are also all the time reconstructed. Yeah, we have this knowledge system is renegotiated, but also due to the interaction, due to the problematic interaction, the borders are reconstructed all the time. And as I said before, a point that interests me especially is how states are involved in this, or state actors, political actors, and so on. And one part is that, or one interesting feature is that you can see this also in national discourses or narratives about nationality. So you can see these diverse modes of dealing with diversity. Because in the end, I would say we are talking about heterogeneities in a society that are then perceived as diversity and are dealt with. And so just, I guess you know this, but you have diverse modes and you have these ideas of assimilation, integration, inclusion, etc. Diverse concepts, but they are mainly the same. Then you have the other mode, like in apartheid systems, where you have segregation, racist ideas of purity, and so on. That's a funny point, is it can be argumented as a kind of conviviality, but everyone staying in his place, what happened in South Africa, for example. Then you have this idea of miscegenation. I always struggle with the English word of mestizaging. I guess very known to all of you. Then you have these ideas of, like, it's like a spin-off, I would say, of branchiamento, whitening, and so on. And the German version would be, I don't know if you agree, but discourses on integration, because in Germany there's a strong focus on that foreigners, people supposed to be foreigners, seen as foreigners, should integrate. But the discourse itself always reconstructs the idea that you will never achieve that. Yeah, a classical sentence is, oh, you're already speaking German relatively good, but you will never speak it well. And if you speak it perfect, then it's also a problem. Then you are also not integrated, so you have no chance of being integrated. In Germany, I'm sorry, yeah. Not in this manner, not by the discourse. Of course, from a functional perspective or from a social perspective, you are integrated, but that's another perspective. And also an interesting point is that often states or those discourses construct areas of contact, maybe, frontiers, borders, as wastelands. For example, like, I don't know, I don't really know if the case in Brazil would fit, but maybe Amazonia seen as a wasteland. You had in Argentine this idea, this concept of conquista del desierto, which means that supposedly there was no one living in these desert areas. But of course there were indigenous people, so it was no one. You have the same construction in the Karoo, for example, in South Africa, and so on. And I would say maybe even you could have wasteland in cities, yeah? Maybe you could conceive a favela as a wasteland. I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay. So just to tell you, the context I'm working at the moment, it's and the corresponding discourse in Mexico. It's this idea of raza cósmica. I'm going to explain it a bit more later. Well, Brazil, I don't have to explain you, and I won't dare to try that here. And in South Africa, after apartheid, you have this idea of the rainbow nation, which in a way is similar, in other ways is different. And well, I've been talking about Germany before. Okay, so just to explain what I'm talking about, and I've done more fieldwork really in Mexico, also ethnographic fieldwork for a long time. In Mexico, you have got this the variation of mestizaje is very much rooted in this idea of raza cósmica. Have you heard about it before? Okay, that's good. Raza cósmica, it was, it's an idea that is related, or it was coined by José Vasconcelos in the 20s after the Mexican Revolution, and it became like, for a certain time, like the state's ideology. And the idea is, well, let's say, as in all parts of Latin America and other places, colonized places in the world, the independent states, they had to deal with their population, so to say. And often in the beginning, you had these tendencies of whitening, where they tried like to copy an European ideal of national subjects. Yeah? That existed in Mexico. In the 19th century, the ideal citizen would have been a Catholic male that lived in a city and that was a merchant or something like that, you know? And well, more perfectly, it would be a criollo in the sense of being a poor Spanish but born in the colonies, yeah. And then, like I would say, like also in Brazil, then it became obvious that that wouldn't work. You couldn't like. States tried like to change their population, but it didn't work in the end. And so they took over this idea that seems to be connected to French anthropology, this idea of universal race. Yeah? But he coined it as raza cósmica. That means that the idea was you had these pre-colonial cultures, but only the high cultures, let's say those who built temples and so on, not the other ones. And you had the European cultures, and they would fusion, they would mix, and then you would have a perfect race, the cosmic race, that would expand all over the world, and that would be the best of all races. So you see, often people think it's like more inclusive and so on and anti-racist, but in the end it's also very racist because you have several problems with that. I'm not going to talk about this now because it would be too much. But the important point is it was a very powerful discourse with the idea to integrate especially indigenous people into Mexican society that was seen as modern Mexican society. Yeah? So you have this Eurocentric idea of modernity also. Okay. Something interesting is, it's here, okay. Well, so let's say it was an offer for indigenous people to take part in this new modernity. Yeah, you're allowed to take part. You are not seen anymore as an indigenous problem, as it was seen before, but you could take part. And for me, it's interesting that by that time, it was acknowledged that this so-called indigenous problem was a social construction. It had to do with power relations. It had to do with categorizations. So the idea was you could change that by giving people access to education, very, very important, that aspect, and also through development or social politics. And that's what the state did. And then I have to see if it's on the next slide. No, okay. That politics were called indigenismo. Yeah, and it's often misunderstood as some kind of, how do you say, of preserving cultures, indigenous cultures. It's a way around. It was a way to address indigenous people, to convince them to lose their cultures, their ideas, their life words, their epistemologies, and to convert to modern Mexico. Well, we can skip this just to say, it's if you ask in Mexico, people wouldn't tell you. They would say it doesn't exist anymore. The raza cosmica, it's not there, this idea, and indigenismo is something that ended in the 60s or 70s, people would say. But if you take a close look, so you notice that it's still there, and it's there in state actions, in social politics and so on. It's the same ideas and the same, what interests me, the same social practices of relating to people. But it's also still the normative point in social imaginaries about Mexican society. So it's like normative to become a mestizo. Yeah? So you're always seen as strange, as a kind of, how do you say this? Is it othering? Alteridade? You always have this feature, yeah? If you do not subsume as a mestizo. Yeah. Okay, and that helps to invisibilize Afrodescendientes, indigenous groups, and so on, their forms of organization, everything. Okay. So, just to tell you briefly, because it was in my title and it's like my concept, I've been at unease with a lot of concepts that try to refer to those groups, like marginalized, subaltern, in Mexico maybe peripheral, in Mexico and Brazil peripheral, so on, because due to this northern mode of categorization, it always seems like to be a static category. Yeah, you cannot get rid of this position, so it's often almost essentialistic. If you are indigenous once, you will ever be indigenous. And there will be no change, because then you have the stereotypes that tell you that indigenous people are backward, traditionalistic, and so on and so on. Well, you have got also the romanticizing version that tells you that they are noble and so on. Yeah, but it's always like this idea of boxing. And so the heterogeneity, complexity, and so they are invisibilized. And so they are, and that's what I'm interested in the moment, there are specific modes, social practices to reconstruct this position all the time. Yeah? It's a dynamic position, but the funny fact is that despite of all politics of empowerment, of diversity management or whatever, these groups will always stay minoritized. That's why I call it socially minoritized groups. And again, here it's a point of this day-to-day reconstruction. Huh? Okay. Yeah. And so also, I guess you know this ideas of coloniality of power, this decolonial thinking. For me, it's very much related to this because at least in colonial context, but I would say also in Europe, also in Germany, you have this feature that creates this hierarchy that makes that this colonial ideas and power relations and so on go on. And that is very much seen in these processes of social minoritization. And just to say it quickly, like Aníbal Quijano said, you have like four strands, is it right? Yeah, like four. I always imagine it as four pillars that are like carrying the system, yeah? And for Quijano it was racism, racial categorizations, racist categorizations, capitalism and Eurocentrism, and then due to the critics by others, also patriarchy or sexism was integrated. And the point is that you can delete one pillar, two pillars, but the system will still stand. So you can do like affirmative action in questions of gender, but it won't change the system. You can be anti-capitalist, but that alone won't change the system, and so on. Yeah. Okay. And for me now, here the point is that these groups that are mostly affected by this, that they are often then, how do you say? Yeah, I'm looking at the English word. Oh no, it's confusion. Well, they are, let's say, they are, ach Mann, zurückgesetzt. Wie sagt man denn? Jetzt finde ich nicht mal das deutsche Wort. Desprivilegiado? Yeah? Okay. So in the end, they always get a lower status, a lower hierarchy. That's what I mean. And it normally works in this combination that they are seen, for example, as passive and needy. They do not really have agency. So even if you are not like overtly aggressive towards them, but then you might have a paternalistic stance because you would say, oh, poor indigenous people, we have to help them to whatever, to get education, to get better living conditions and so on, not accepting that they would have their own agency and their own ways of handling things. Yeah, and so you have all the stereotypes. They are underdeveloped, even anti-modern and so on. And in my research on politics, I saw that they are often labeled as even as not apt for democracy. Yeah, so they could not live like clientelistic relations and so on. Okay, well, in the end, they would be like kind of victims without human agency, and so they would not be real social actors, because social actors have agency. They don't have, they are not attributed to have. And thus, also in terms of contact and transfer, they would be victims. It's like this idea that if they, if indigenous people get in contact with the so-called modern world, they will lose like everything what's theirs, their culture and so on, and they will be like, there will be the modern culture will be filled in. If they wouldn't be able to handle and to navigate and to choose. Yeah? Okay. Do you know this? I don't know if something like that existed in the Portuguese colonies. That's from the Spanish colonies. It's called a caste table, tabla de castas. Yeah, and just to show you briefly, well, what do you think? What could it be? I just told you it's from the colonies, so it has to do something with colonization. Do you have an idea? Yeah, kinds of things, yeah, right? Yeah. Okay, it's in the end, that's a basis. It's a racial categorization of people. And so you have contact in here because you have mixture, so to say, this idea of mixture. And it was like creating categorizations for every possible way of mixture, so to say, yeah, in a very racist manner. But what do you think, what was it used for? Well, you could say it's this European idea of having to categorize everything. That's true, but there was something more to it.
Probably an order, no?
Yeah.
Who gets hospital?
It's
where you stand in the
yeah, exactly. That's social.
Vulnerability, I guess, to enslavement or not, social status.
Yeah.
Property, access to land.
Yeah, yeah. So this defines social order in the end. Yeah. The persons that were really enslaved, they are not here. They are outside. Like are the well, of course, you have here a Spanish man, but the Spanish with Spanish, they would be outside. It's really just to classify like this idea of mixture. And then you can see that they have different types of clothing, and they have certain instrument, and that indicates really that they were allowed to have certain professions, yeah, based on this idea of in which way they were racially mixed. That was the idea. Of course, it means that there was the idea that those persons would be apt, for example, for administrative works, and this here would be apt just for, I don't know, here fishing, for example, and so on, yeah? So you can see all of the stereotypes in here, and it's like this materialized social order. Wow! Okay, so I'm going to skip some things. Okay, well, then I'll talk faster, I'm sorry. Well, and interesting, I guess you know this concept of the borderlands by Gloria and Sadua and this idea of border dwellers, but there are other theoreticians, like for example, well, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui or Guillaume Bocara and so on, Guillaume Bocara, that show that often the people that were living in those spaces seen as frontiers or that were confronted with social borders, they have another ability to deal with social borders. They are more used to live in different social worlds and so on. And normally, we as not border dwellers, we are not used to, because we are used to believe in the norms and to have certain ideas about things. But if you move from one social world into another world, you have to adapt. And the argument here would be that certain groups, like for example indigenous people, when they left their communities, they were always confronted with this border situation. And they always knew that they had to adapt to the place they were going to. A variant would be that what Gloria Anzaldúa was writing about, migrants that would come to another place and would have to adapt to the new setting, but would gain a certain ability to do so. But of course, as I said before, it's a power-laden process, and it's a very harsh process, yeah? But the problem is that this ability, this flexibility is often, or it's normally not recognized. Normally, things that happen then are seen as like a failure to behave properly or to see the world properly and so on, yeah? And I make this quick. I like this quote Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui said, saying that actually the indigenous people that are often seen as backwarded, as traditionalistic and so on, as I said, are the more modern ones in the sense that they are more diverse, they are more able to take things, to appropriate things from other groups, from other social contexts. 10 minutes, okay. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Just, you have to see, concerning systems of knowledge, often you can talk of that these groups have even other epistemologies. So one would have to get to this ecologies of knowledge, a term coined by Boaventura de Sousa Santos. And I'm going to skip this, sorry. Okay. Just to tell you quickly, you often have diverse actors that then, in negotiations with the state, how would you say, they often seem like being co-opted, but from their perspective, it's a way of getting recognition. Yeah. I'm skip this. I'll show you some pictures better. Yeah. Maybe we can come back to this. Here you can see that was during a campaign for electure of mayor in a municipality, and you can see a lot of things, but I won't have time. But this person is a bilingual teacher, the bilingual teacher, and he is representing the village, the indigenous village. Bilingual teachers in this idea of indigenismo, they were seen as a person that could be a link between indigenous communities and the state, or let's say between indigenous communities and modern Mexico. So the state educated them to influence and to assimilate indigenous communities. Indigenous communities and members attributed them being educated persons, having knowledge, knowing how to handle this outside world and so on. And that caused a lot of problems for them, because in the end it could have been a good position as a broker, but they could not fulfill either expectations. Yeah? But they are important political actors, and so you can see it's a typical situation with a staged political interaction, and so it always works like the same, and it shows a lot of disrespect towards the people. I cannot tell you now, but maybe another moment. What do you think? What is happening here? No idea? No idea. Okay. Well, this guy was a candidate for the post of the governor, and it was an ethnically defined clientelist organization that was making up this event. Do you now have an idea what is staged here? No? Okay. So the lady, as like the performance of an indigenous person, often a woman, often wearing a scar and her supposedly traditional clothes that are often not so traditional, is handing over something that is meant to be a staff of command. So the message would be, we as members of this indigenous group, for us, you are our leader, despite of election. But the funny thing is, and that's why I like to use this, that there was never this idea of a staff of command in this region. There is in other regions, but it's not here. And, well, you cannot know, but even the design and the art craft, it doesn't fit to the region. But anyhow, they used this staging as a powerful symbol, so to say. And again, this idea of disregard, of disrespect. Yeah? Okay, so I skip also this, but you can see that this political interaction is very much laden with this coloniality of power, because it's full of disregard, is this idea of they are helpless and so on. Okay, yeah. Just to show another two pictures where you can see more this colonial aspect. This is a similar idea, but I think it's even more harsh, you know, because it's she's kneeling and she's like, how do you call that in English? You have incense, and often there are a lot of rituals with incense, yeah, also syncretistic rituals. But here, I would say it's really overstressed, because this is a candidate for, I don't remember for what, and the lady again representing the indigenous group. And also this one from the pandemic, where you can see this colonial idea. This is a member of the state government, and you see, he's helping the old lady to protect herself from the pandemic, from COVID. Okay, I guess I have 4 minutes, right, Vito? I'm going to skip, well, no, I'm going to tell this, but more quickly. So often it seems as if, in that case, indigenous people, but it refers also to other groups, as if they were like helpless and they had like to perform this loyalty to state actors and so on. But the point is, they are not so helpless. They know what they do. They know how to handle the state actors. That's the point. And it's often not seen also in academics because of this concept of Luis Tapia, the subsuelo politico. It's like the idea you have an informal space where a lot of politically important things happen, but they are not recognized as political. So it's spaces of non-politics, as he says. And often it's the fundament, the basic of even the state. In Mexico, I would say that, and Luis Tapia says it's in Bolivia, but it's not recognized. And so it's again this disregard. But it means if you turn it the way around, you have this, it's a space for permanent negotiation, contacts, conflicts can be mitigated and so on. And well, Luis Tapia's hope is that maybe, I guess, someday a revolution could surge from there. Yeah. Well, and you could say maybe that's what happened with Evo Morales, more or less in Bolivia. Yeah. Okay. So one has to see the rationality, the logics of interaction of these people. And so, again, it's important to see that they have this flexibility to adapt. They understand the state actors more than the state actors understand them. It's, again, a system of ignorance. And often this mixes with these ideas of hidden resistance, for example, by James Scott, where I would say, they stage this, they stage loyalty, they take part in everything, but they do it in a manner in which they can maintain their own autonomous space, yeah? So and if you cross this red line, this border, then you would have a real, like, what would you say, social explosion, a conflict. Okay, yeah, and it's often also this way of strategic essentialism and so on. Okay, yeah, there are diverse strategies, ample repertoire. It's not, maybe it's like you were saying about languages. It's not so often thought that it's simple. It's a simplistic manners, but it's very much elaborated, their strategies, and how they decide when to do what and so on. Because they take into account this diverse ideas, this diverse social worlds. Well, my last example, and then I'm going to finish, and I'm not going to explain this all, but indigenous migration is an interesting aspect also because it has often been overlooked, meant by the societies, but also by academia. If you have people working on migration between Mexico and the US, for example, they normally, if they take this into account, they see migration of indigenous people as an exception. Yeah? But there are hints that probably even the pioneering migrants, they were indigenous people, but they were not labeled as such. And one of the problems is that from a US point of view, to put it very simple, everyone who comes from south of the border is Mexican, and that's it. No heterogeneity, no diversity, you just box them as Mexicans. And they can be Bolivians or Ecuadorians or whatever. And from the Mexican point of view, remembering this idea of raza cosmica, of modern Mexican society, the problem is that indigenous people were not attributed a modern lifestyle, and mobility was seen as a modern feature. Indigenous people were seen as living, sitting on mountains, in jungles, in swamps and so on, but not like people that would move to another place. And so they were not seen in the end. And I cannot tell you now, it would be another talk, but you have a lot of interesting features. And now really my last slide. One of these features is something that a colleague, Maria Guadalupe Rivera Garay, is calling the School of Migration. It's a concept that existed before, but she refined it in relation to indigenous communities, seeing that for many of these communities, for their social reproduction, for their identification and so on, migration is very important. It's not now just this idea of going to the US. It has always been, and it has also been from pre-colonial times. So it's another way of mobility, of seeing mobilities. And the point is that it's like a school, because during this process, they acquire a lot of, let's say, technical or lexical knowledge, but also a lot of experiences that they can use and they can transfer. And her example is a community that built up a very prosperous touristic project by taking certain ideas from Las Vegas, where they migrated to, but also a lot of their own ideas. No? You see, normally people would say, oh, they took over this US idea of whatever. But that's not the point. The point is that they knew how to combine, how to adapt it to their reality. Yeah, okay. Well, and the problem is, again, it's not understood that way, but stereotype views makes that it's not that the potentials are not really seen. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Muito obrigado.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I have first a clarification question. The broker you mentioned, the teacher, I expect him to be bilingual, right? Are they bilingual?
Yeah. Well, shall I explain?
Yeah.
The idea was that the state. Oh, sorry. The idea was that the state have to install bilingual schools. But again, the idea was not to preserve the indigenous language, but it was like the idea that you had to approach indigenous children, pupils, in their language and then change it gradually to Spanish to integrate them into modern society. And the ones who were supposed to do this were the bilingual teachers that normally were from, no, that always were from indigenous communities. Yeah.
I have another question, which I forgot now. Wait a second. When you talked about the fact that they somehow managed to preserve their autonomy, I was wondering, in the case of that lady who handed the politician that object, which doesn't belong to her community, which is not an ethical or a magical or a religious object relevant to her. Was this interpreted as a sign that that was not real, that she was that was fake, that she was kind of pretending to accept his leadership when she was not? Because this is what, when we deal with the indigenous communities here, we feel that often, that they are granting something to us because that doesn't mean anything to them.
Yeah.
So they can change their mind and we'll just say, but you gave me this. And they say, okay, so
I don't need it. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Enjoy it.
Yeah, but I think that's the point. It's diverse logics, diverse rationalities of interaction. You can. Well, I have to say I took this picture from Facebook. I wasn't there, so I couldn't talk to people about that, but maybe I should try anyhow. But the people I've been doing research with whom I lived in the indigenous communities in that region, they didn't go there. They wouldn't have gone there, because it's really like this post-revolutionary idea in Mexico that you need organizations to mobilize the masses. And so it's this idea of acclamation of a leader. So if the masses show that this will be the leader, and this I would see it just as like a variation putting in this supposedly ethnic element. But, well, then anyhow it works because they do that, because they expect that in contrast for the supposed loyalty, they would get certain resources. They would be able to partake in what the state is giving. So that's what I meant, that it's often very much ritualized.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I guess they would not give something away that would be really important to them.
Exactly.
But they would always have like this fake features to.
Exactly.
So the other one can think.
That's the feeling I have. You know, that we are the ones being fooled.
Yeah.
You know, we think we are fooling them, but they are not being fooled.
Yeah,
we are the ones being fooled. Yeah. Thank you.
More questions?
I would like to ask if there's some change or prejudice about identity, the concept of identity of people that suffer from contact in a social context.
I don't know if I got it. You mean?
Like, well, I am. If I am the result of. If I'm the result of a contact,
yeah.
Is there some change or some difficult of understanding my identity in comparison with my parents or the people that came before me?
Yeah. Okay, the point is that depends very much upon the society, upon the specific social context, upon the situation. Because something, I didn't tell you, but I started to do also research in South Africa, and it's very interesting to compare it with Mexico and Brazil and so on. But an interesting point is that I would say in Mexico it's more marked even than in Brazil, but this mestizo, like the mixed category, is a privileged one. The other one, the purely seen as purely European, doesn't lose its privileges, but okay. And in South Africa, I found it striking that you have the category that is called colored as a mixed category. They are attributed to be mixed, so they are often not mixed, but they are sometimes, it's what I skipped, Khoisan, First Nation people and so on, but they are all subsumed as being not white and not black in categorization. And they are, at the moment, they have the most problematic position. Yeah, so it really depends upon what happens.
Yes.
So, but in the end, I would say, from a sociological perspective, this idea of identity doesn't really work because, again, it's like a container concept. So I would prefer to talk about belongings that are much more flexible and you can navigate, and so you can have also other generational relations and so on. Yeah?
That makes more sense. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed your talk, and also I was trying to figure out in my head where the linkages would be with some of the, work on Creoles, particularly because the concept of hybridization is also a very strong concept in Creole studies. Whether it's accepted or not by researchers. Now, one thing that strikes me when I'm comparing, let's say, Caribbean or American discourses with Africa is, of course, that in Africa the majority of countries are not settler colonies, right? So the whole discourse on indigeneity is not very prominent, simply because you don't have white settlers, right? And you didn't have the kind of genocidal land possession process that goes along with settler colonialism. But it's interesting how discourse of hybridity are still infused into even the African context, let's say Nigerian Pidgin and Cameroon Pidgin and these languages, where these are seen as languages without native speakers. Although they have tens of millions of native speakers. They are seen as languages that don't belong to anybody. They're the kind of mestizo products of societies that don't have mestizos, right? So it's interesting that somehow you have this kind of idea of a cultural and linguistic mestiçagem without the people who are, and that's the case with Ghanaian Pidgin or Nigerian Pidgin, right? These languages, they are spoken by more speakers than anybody else, but they are not seen as languages that have native speakers. They are seen as languages that don't belong to anybody. They're seen as interethnic, urban languages. So I'm wondering what you make of that.
Okay, maybe two answers. The first one I was thinking first of, this transference of concepts is always very, very difficult, I would say. In the southern part of Africa, at least, you have now people trying to apply this idea of decoloniality, but you have people discussing or showing you why it doesn't really work, or, well, how it works and how not, and so on. It's an interesting debate. Because normally these concepts are also laden by a certain meaning that refers to a certain context and so on. Yeah, that's why I skipped that also. That's why I'm very much interested in this southern, so to say, approaches to diversity. For example, in Brazil, I would say Lélia Gonzalez was very important because, like this, that what was then taken as intersectionality and was boxed in the northern way, but Lélia Gonzalez intersectionality was open. It was like this. I like this idea of Gloria Anzaldúa saying that it's like a mirror that has to break up into billions of pieces, and that's what diversity would be. And all of us would be very, very, very diverse, and we would stop categorizing. Okay, Mestizaje. Maybe, I don't know if I made a wrong point because I showed this picture from colonial times. But I think we are often, at least in the global north, we are used to talk too much about this idea of racialization. And that's why Mestizaje often is understood as a racial feature, so to say. But it's more a cultural point. So I would even say that in the Americas, Mestizaje is more cultural than people mixing. Because then you would again have this idea of this strong categories. And you can see that because if in Mexico, if someone is perceived as a mestizo or not, is a social question. You cannot see it by the color of the skin or by its, how do you say, features and so on. It's stupid. It has always been stupid. So if there is a mestizaje, it's a cultural one, and I would say it's about, in the end, about epistemologies, for example, but not what, as we know, there has been also a lot of physically voluntary, involuntary mixture and so on, and there are no pure indigenous communities, for example. Yeah. And so it's an interesting point, or an interesting question to think about that. Of course, it's difficult to argument if you have to show where this mestizaje, where this hybridization, where the transfers have taken place, but maybe then it would work better to look at specific processes.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because in a way, of course, because social facts are changing so quickly in all of Africa, and the speed is so breathtaking of the social, economic, and demographic change that's going on right now. People are in need, of course, of recreating a lot of these very strict categories, many of which were created by colonial rule, of course. The fixed boundaries of ethnic groups and the kind of attributes that people are supposed to have, their homeland, and Yoruba is like this, and Yoruba, of course, is also a created term. It didn't exist before colonialism. And these ethnic descriptors, right? Because you have this whole new population of cities who are going to be the majority in 30 or 40 years, who are in need of new forms of negotiating their identities, right? And that's where the Creole languages come in so handy, because you don't need to align yourself with any ethnicity anymore by saying, I am a speaker of Nigerian Pidgin, and this is who I am. I'm from Lagos.
Yeah.
And I'm from Accra, and that's all that counts.
Okay,
I might have a Yoruba father and an Igbo mother or something, but I am from Lagos, and so the language gets this kind of it's a new boundary marker, but in a very different way from the previously inherited traditionalizing.
Okay. Yeah, so that's what I meant. You could have multiple belongings, but you don't have to identify
and it's good
with
enough.
a
I mean, it works perfectly for multiple belongings.
Yeah.
I mean,
but I think the problem comes in if then people start to, if you have power relations and people start to talk about authenticity, for example, then you have this, also the term, this parrots of belongings, and it gets problematic. And I would also skip that when Gloria and Sadua is talking about this borderlands concerning people from Mexican descent living in the US, concerning languages, it's always this problem of not speaking correct. If you talk Chicano, if you talk whatever, they are very multilingual, these people, they know when to use what, and they know, it's really an ability. But they are always stigmatized as the ones who do not speak proper English and do not speak proper Spanish, and so they are, I would say minoritized. They are disregarded. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to you. Thank you for your time.
So I just have to thank the invited speakers for their presence at the University of São Paulo. This is, for us, it's amazing to have you here, and I hope that the workshop was productive and enlightening for everybody that took part in this. And let's hope that we manage to establish more, bridges across these institutions, and get students moving around. And yes, so thank you so much. Thank you for all, and thank you for those who are here with us today. Okay, a final round of applause for all of us. Pode.